So hey guys, this is your favorite fictional vortex. So in this video, we will see what if Naruto become a thunder god, snake Sannin and water demon. But before we start, remember to subscribe and like this video. Now let's start. Loud and obnoxious laughter rang clear through the early morning skies of Konohagakure no Sato, quickly followed by shouted expletives and roars of rage. 10-year-old Uzumaki Naruto had just succeeded in doling out retribution worthy of the mythical kitsunes to a number of shopkeepers who had unfairly overcharged the blonde child for certain items. The group of chunins in hot pursuit were the unlucky few who were on duty the morning that Naruto's pranks occurred. Running through their minds was the thought of just how a kid capable of such ingenuity could be an academy dead last. The chunin in the lead quickly refocused on the orange-wearing child only to realize that he was in fact gaining on him. In his anticipation of an end to the chase, he neglected to take into account the fact that for the past hour, Naruto had maintained a steady lead in this game of cat and mouse. A more experienced ninja would have suspected a trap, and rightly so. As Naruto neared the edge of the roof, he was on his sharp hearing confirmed what his too sensitive nose, far more sensitive than loudmouth Kiba's and that just doesn't make sense, had already told him. So, a quick vulpine grin flitted across his face just as the chunin directly on his tail reached out to grab him, only to witness Naruto dive from the roof they were on, curl his body into a ball and sail smoothly through a conveniently open window and fluidly unroll into an uninterrupted run. The chunin cursed because he was too close to the blonde to follow and absently mused that he had been well played. The ninja immediately following the hoodwinked chunin was however quick to follow Naruto. Executing the same maneuver, he prepared to shift his roll smoothly into a run only to crash against a solid object. Before the unfortunate chunin could recover from the damage, his comrade who had already jumped after him in a similar motion crashed into him as he rebounded, and together they fell into an open dumpster that sprung shut with a click. Naruto's laughter let the remaining chunin know that that was no unfortunate accident. Continuing in his run, Naruto thought about the genius of painting around the small window, so small his malnourished stunted frame could just fit through, to give the illusion that it was big enough for a full-grown man to fit through. He quickly left the building knowing that the chunin would have realized where he would pop out of and would resume the chase. However, his little window trick had bought him the few seconds he knew he would need for what he was about to do. When he had planned this prank out, see, Iruka-sensei, I can think so ahead, he had ensured that various escape routes would be open to him, and even allowed for the possibility of the ninja chasing him managing to anticipate some of those routes. True to his prediction, he glanced up to find several shapes flitting in and out of the edge of his vision, lying in wait for him if he took certain paths in his bid to escape. A quick mental calculation revealed that of his 7 escape routes, only 2 remained uncompromised. In one world, Uzumaki Naruto would have chosen the left path, eventually run into Iruka, and life would continue as we know it. He chose right, and the story of Uzumaki Naruto ended 10 hours later, while the story of Namikaze Uzumaki Naruto began. Sarutobi Hiruzen was having a bad day. He got out of bed with more aches in his old bones than he went to bed with. He had walked into his dining room to find his son eating. Well, that was before said son noticed him and chose to leave rather than finish his food and thus end up speaking to him. To top it all off, no matter what his ninja might say, he suffered the backlash of whatever mischief Naruto got up to more than any other, delivered in the doubling and sometime tripling of his paperwork. So that morning was not a good one for him, and to make it worse, his door opened to admit an old man with bandages covering a majority of his body, including one of his eyes. When the Yami no Shinobi came calling, it could mean nothing good. What do you want, Danzo? As you can see, I am very busy this morning, Sarutobi bit out. We both know that your extra workload is as a result of your softness, was the reply. Sighing in weary exasperation, the Hokage replied, when will you drop this argument, Danzo? I have made my views on this matter clear. As always happened in the past during such arguments, Danzo was getting agitated. You allow that child to waste his potential. You and I know just what that child could become if only. Rising from his chair, Sarutobi thundered, enough. Listen to yourself. You call him a child in one breath and turn around to propose him becoming a weapon. The frustration of his morning had finally come to a head. Danzo stopped for a moment and took a good look at his former teammate. He realized that years of seeing Hiruzen behind a desk had lulled him into a false sense of complacency when it came to his teammate. Internally, he decided to scrap the present form of offense and switch tactics. Very well, however, you allow him to be treated as he is, and without the proper guidance he might give in to the beast sealed into him and turn against us all. No one knows just how containing the Kyuubi will affect the child's mental state. You will see Konoha burn because of some misplaced sentiment. Proper guidance? You mean torture disguised as training for the sole purpose of creating a weapon in the shell and guise of a child? If that is what it takes, Danzo stoically replied. Sarutobi was not normally one to be deterred, but when the Sandame looked into Danzo's eyes he knew that none of his words were getting through and curse him, but he just wanted Danzo gone. So he sighed and settled back into his chair. A flicker of surprise crossed Danzo's face at Sarutobi's actions. As the aged Hokage lit his pipe, he decided on a course of action, anything to get this annoyance over and done with. His impatience would change the future of the elemental nations and cause no small amount of anxiety to an elder toad sage. After taking a few good puffs which served the dual purpose of calming him and aggravating his teammate, though he hid it well, he spoke the words that would damn a child's soul and change the fate of a nation, the fate of the world. I hear your concerns, Danzo, really I do, but let me ask you this. Why do you think I always make time for Naruto? Danzo stilled, his devious mind quickly forming and discarding various thoughts and reaching different conclusions. A glance at Sarutobi revealed a calm visage that gave nothing away. Were he capable of such thought he would have interpreted his teammate's question to mean that the aged Hokage considered it the least he could do for the poor child. However, his scheming mind was almost unable to accommodate such expressions of human kindness. Instead, he smirked and said, I see. By becoming the only light in his darkness, you ensure his complete devotion to you. Turning to leave, Danzo said, It's good to see you haven't lost it all, Hiruzen. Sarutobi sighed sadly at the various twists and turns of his former teammate's thoughts but made no move to correct him. His misled conclusions would satisfy him for a while. He turned around when he felt a chill wind and found the window open. Dismissing it from his mind, he prepared to return to his work, and he allowed a moment of thought to thank Kami that Naruto would never learn of this discussion. It was in a numb haze that Naruto found himself sitting in his apartment, having no recollection of ever journeying there. Maybe the demon is taking me over, and he immediately had to smother a hysterical bubble of laughter that tried to erupt out of his throat. Now that he had a grasp on himself, if somewhat a shaky one, hold do. The first thought was confronting the old man, no, the Hokage, and demanding explanations. He quickly stumped that idea out of existence, not wanting any more lies. No matter how he thought about it, there seemed no way out. Were his faith in the people around him not shaken so thoroughly, he might have fled to Iruka for reassurance and comfort. Indeed, at another time, perhaps in another situation, young Naruto would have worked through the seeming betrayal, clinging stubbornly to his determination to never give up and become all the more powerful for it. But now, in this place, and at this time, the young lad was just a little too broken, just a little too beat down by the harshness of his life that he couldn't go it alone. Naruto came out of his thoughts to find himself holding a worn and discarded ninjutsu that he salvaged from some damaged training ground during one of the times he played ninja by himself. He contemplated and discarded the thought of suicide, not because he was too strong to stoop so low, but because he believed that he could not harm himself fast enough to overcome the freaky, demonic rate of healing he apparently had. At least, that was how he felt until a memory from long ago flashed before his eyes, of when he had a kunai go through his palm during one of his self-training mishaps. He remembered morbidly watching as his wound tried to heal around the object in his path and failed. Casting another glance at the ninjutsu, he burst into motion, never giving himself time to reconsider. Somewhere, maybe not in this life, he believed he could find the acceptance he needed, and even he recognized the futility of pushing at a mountain. He considered the various lectures given in the academy about fatal points on the human body. The heart it was then. He gripped the handle of the weapon, placed the tip under his beating heart, and with a rare content smile on his face he fell forward. A quicksilver flash of pain gave him second thoughts before it dulled, and he felt his little heart valiantly fighting to keep up its symphony of life, and failing. That was when he felt it, a surge of burning, red, demonic chakra searing through his body to his heart and trying to heal the damage done. At this point Naruto was barely conscious enough to feel the chakra fight to heal him with the blade in the way. Finally about to fade away, he gave a moment to think of the family he never knew and pray that he meets them in the next life. With that last thought, he closed his eyes and gave into the blackness. The Kyuubi was startled awake for the first time in a decade to find his host's body failing around him and the mental landscape crumbling. He had a split second to react, and he made the wrong call. A seasoned shinobi would have pushed the panic and acted. The Kyuubi, for all that he had existed for centuries, never had to learn that brute force did not solve everything. So, he sent a surge of concentrated Yuki to the injury and watched in glee as it burnt away the obstruction preventing his host from getting healed. His glee turned to horror as he realized that Naruto's young body could not handle the potency of his Yuki yet, and he watched helplessly as the very organ he tried to heal corroded due to the toxicity of his Yuki. The mental landscape around him began to vanish as his host finally left the cruel world. Seconds earlier, at the first surge of pure unadulterated malevolence, the Sannin Hokage was out of his seat quick as a shot. Even as his conscious mind denied what his decades-old senses had confirmed, his body was already aligning with the window behind his desk, muscles flexing in preparation, chakra pooling in the required areas, and at the second surge of physical hatred he was off faster than any eye could track. It took the Anbu stationed in his office precious seconds to understand what their hair standing on end meant before they were in quick pursuit. With speed worthy of the professor himself, Sarutobi appeared in Naruto's apartment in a storm of chakra and a mind already plotting ways to drag the upcoming battle out of range of the village with as little collateral damage as possible. The raging tsunami of chakra and sheer focus flickered and was snuffed out of existence. The Anbu dog, who was the first of his group to arrive, left eye red and spinning furiously in its socket, stumbled as he came out of his shunshin, his Sharingan ensuring that the sight before him would haunt his nightmares until the day he died. The professor, who had arrived like a force of nature, was nowhere to be seen. In its place an aged man stood, staring at one of his life's many failures that, although in no way the worst, one that he will always regret. Slowly, knowing that he was already too late, 10 years too late, he moved over to the corpse of his grandson in all but blood. The entire Anbu squad had arrived by this point, and the silence that permeated the room was reminiscent of when the body of the Yondaime was brought back that day, a decade ago. Softly, gently, like a mountain being worn down by time, an aged oak tree bowing before the unyielding storm, he fell to his knees at Naruto's side. With hands so steady they shook, he reached out and drew the body closer. He was not aware he had tears in his eyes, and as he saw a few drops of liquid slide down the boy's cheeks, he absently wondered if the pipes were leaking again. Perhaps I should get someone to refurbish the entire building someday. Gripping the handle of the ninjutsu, he pulled it out, hating the blood that stained the blade. Much too soon, still a child and already has his blood on a blade. He discarded the thief that stole this child from him and bowed his head over the rapidly cooling body, and finally allowed himself to acknowledge that he will never hear the voice of Konoha's precious son, and savior. Namikaze Uzumaki Naruto watched as once again, life proved too much for an Uzumaki Naruto. He wouldn't blame the child though, he could never judge him for buckling under a weight that should never have been his to bear. Once again, he stood on an illusionary knife edge, knowing he was deluding himself into thinking that there existed a choice to be made at all. Move on and leave this world to make do without the child of prophecy, for as long as it existed anyway, or do as he has always done, as he would always do, and step forward to take his place. Meh, he thought with a faint smile, I was due a vacation anyway. And with that last thought, Namikaze Uzumaki Naruto descended into the corpse held in the arms of a sorrowful and broken old man. The Kyuubi raged as he felt his host's soul finally leave his body. He knew that he clung to his anger as a dying man might cling to a straw in a turbulent sea of terror and soul-searing fear. Then he felt it. The cold arms of nullity, the pure antithesis to reality and existence, the final full stop in every story that has ever begun, the call of the Shinigami, death. When Namikaze Minato dared to shackle a god to foolish mortal whims, he could never grasp just what it was he had done. Just what unnatural deed he had wrought. The Shinigami reached through the seal like it never existed and pulled, and the Kyuubi knew pain. It was a testament to the sheer genius of the Yondaime Hokage that the death god met some resistance, tiny and unnoticeable as it was to it. Well, everything is a matter of perspective anyway. While the death god merely desired the soul of the Kyuubi, desired it with a hunger to devour all of creation, it had no interest in the actual accumulated power of the Kyuubi. The seal placed on Naruto fought the extraction as best it could, and the result was the consciousness of the Kyuubi being removed ahead of its power. Its Yuki. Doubtless, the power would have followed the soul eventually, that is, unless Namikaze Uzumaki Naruto had a thing to say about it. Through the pain of having his soul and consciousness separated from his power, the Kyuubi felt a wall slam down between the two parts. Cutting off WL at the added pain, the Kyuubi was finally devoured whole and the death god left, the only proof of its presence being the sheer lack of vitality in the world. Almost as though someone had washed out all the colors in the world, leaving them dulled. The ninja in the room felt as though they had just rubbed shoulders with the Grim Reaper himself. Kakashi had already began spiraling into a pit of self-disgust and regret as he saw the Sannin cradling Naruto's body. Minato-sensei, wake up. Please wake up. Obito. No, Kakashi, it's Rin, she's gone. He wondered why he even bothered as his plans to retire from Anbu in time to take on a genin team went up flames. The other ninja each remembered times when they interacted with the little child. True, more often than not, it was to catch him after some act of mischief, but not one of them could deny the good-natured fun and cheer he injected into everything. And so as they looked on as their leader mourned, they each offered up silent prayers, much like they would do for fallen comrades. Sarutobi pulled himself together and prepared to rise with the body. He stopped, the ninja around him going on alert as well. He wondered what had triggered his senses. For a moment he pondered if the person who did this was still around, firmly refusing to acknowledge what the lack of forced entry, struggle and the peaceful smile on Naruto's face meant, and how long he could keep them alive for while they suffered his fury. And then he felt it again, a pulse of chakra. The ninja around him shifted in alarm, preparing themselves for anything, well, almost anything. Jaws dropped, eyes widened and bodies flinched in shock as the body in the arms of the Hokage arched up, took in a deep breath and let loose a scream that penetrated to the bone, nay the very soul. Abandon hope all ye who enter here, Namikaze Uzumaki Naruto has arrived. The Sannin Hokage returned the greetings of the hospital staff he met on his way to his destination. It had been 2 months since that horrible day he had found Naruto bleeding to death from an attempted suicide. Even now, knowing that the child had survived, the memory still caused his breath to hitch in his chest and his body to tense. He finally arrived at the door to the private room that contained the comatose blue-eyed child. Though undetectable to almost everyone else, he easily made out the 2 Anbu guards that were stationed outside the room. He opened the door, preparing to go in, and froze in his steps. The Anbu Inu was at his side in an instant, checking to see what had startled the professor. The sight before him caused his throat to close off and his body to tense. During the 2 months his body was in a coma, Naruto had been busy. As soon as his senses informed him that he was alone in the hospital room, save for the 2 Anbu outside the door, he got to work. The first thing he did was weave a smooth layer of chakra just underneath his skin, making sure not to let the untrained chakra of his new body surge in any way and alert the Anbu outside. While it was a relatively easy thing for him to pull off, he knew that for anyone else, save maybe Senju Tsunade, it would be practically impossible to accomplish. The purpose of the layer of chakra was to serve as a shield, a force field if you will, to keep anyone outside from sensing what was happening inside it. With that done, and while maintaining a firm hold on the chakra layer, the real work began. Softly, deftly, he siphoned off a tiny amount of the Kyuubi's yuki and began work at the bones. With a skill born of numerous lives spent as a doctor, scientist, apprentice of Tsunade and even a few times as the second coming of the snake Sannin. Yup. Those were dark times indeed. He coaxed the bones of his body to adapt as he wanted. Over the period of 2 weeks, every single one of his bones became incredibly dense, strong, flexible and almost unbreakable. True, it wasn't anything like a Kagaya, but it was sure as hell damn close. A side effect of this procedure was an increase in height, putting him at above average for his age group. The next step was to craft muscles to handle the increased body weight. Over the next 3 weeks he meticulously broke down and rebuilt every single muscle in his body. While he was at it, he also burned away a lot of the baby fat in his body and improved his nerves and reaction times. Then he improved on the efficiency of his body's internal organs, strengthening his heart, lungs, kidneys and other organs to function at way above peak efficiency even by ninja standards. Lung capacity increased exponentially, as well as metabolism and energy output. 5 weeks after the start of his coma, his physical attributes were way beyond what any of his peers could achieve even while boosting themselves with chakra. Without the use of chakra, he would still be the fastest and strongest, the best of any ninja in his generation. And these were basically his base stats. They would undoubtedly improve as he trained himself further. Next, he tackled his brain. After all, it wouldn't do if the brain was not on par with the consciousness using it. Knowing that this was the most delicate operation yet, he took his time. With the most minuscule amount of Yuki he could get away with, he set about modifying the brain's neural pathways and augmenting various synapses, enabling his brain to process things at a significantly improved rate. In addition to the brain, he didn't forget to take care of his senses. Of course, he wasn't doing anything as outrageous as giving himself a dojutsu, though after having gone down the same path as Orochimaru many times before he knew all their structures inside out. However, what he did do was tremendously improve and fine-tune all his senses to the point where the level of perception of his eyes coupled with the processing power of his new brain ensured that a single glance was all he would need to completely understand and perfectly recall anything he saw. Simply focusing his hearing, without chakra augmentation, could allow him listen into a conversation hundreds of yards away. His already astounding sense of smell improved so much that a simple sniff could reveal so detailed a story. It would seem as though he was there when it unfolded. His senses were so acute that he was even capable of detecting temperature and barometric changes. At this point it was the start of the 7th week and he was almost done. The final task left was the improvement of his chakra system. Luckily enough, during the entire process of improving his new body, the act of moving Kyuubi's Yuki through the body resulted in some strengthening and widening of the chakra pathways in his body. Nevertheless, it was a fairly straightforward procedure, comparatively. He simply had to circulate as much chakra as his pathways could handle, then gradually increase the amount, much like training a muscle. If he slipped up and circulated more than the chakra pathways could safely handle, slim as the possibility of that happening was, he could easily heal it one of two ways. Using a tiny amount of Kyuubi's Yuki or activating the famed Uzumaki healing factor. On the note of the healing factor, centuries ago, and many lives previously, he had discovered that the healing factor could in fact be controlled. In particular, it turned up in varying strengths in different members of the Uzumaki clan, but without a doubt, the expression of the healing factor was the strongest ever in Uzumaki Naruto. This super factor arose as a result of being conceived by the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi, thus requiring that he, as a child, be able to adapt to survive the minuscule amounts of toxic Yuki he got frequently exposed to during the course of his growth in the womb. Naruto kept up the strengthening and widening of his chakra pathways for days on end. He also induced his body to grow a few extra tenketsus in key locations to further improve his body's chakra control. By the time he was done, it was the end of the 7th week and his body was as close to being the perfect killing machine. He looked upon all that he had wrought, and he saw it was good, and on the 8th week, he rested. After 8 weeks of being in a coma and the subsequent body modifications Naruto had performed, he decided it was finally time to wake up and face this new world. His timing was in fact impeccable because the academy would be resuming in 1 month, giving him more than enough time to settle in and fully integrate himself into his situation before having to interact with people he had grown up with for years. Regardless of how morbid the thought, he acknowledged that little Naruto's successful attempt at suicide would provide a plausible excuse for any changes in behavior that might otherwise have alarmed the people who knew him. He opened his eyes and immediately had to fight to suppress the downright shiver-inducing vulpine grin that threatened to appear on his face. From the very first moment his eyes had opened, his brain had begun rapidly processing everything in his wider-than-average field of vision. He focused on the dust motes floating in the air, backlit by the fluorescent bulb, and in the time between heartbeats he determined reasonably accurate estimates of each individual particle's velocity and thus subsequent path of motion. Passing his hands over the sheet on his body, noticing with a deep sense of accomplishment that his motion was smooth and unhindered by the fact he had been bedridden for 2 months, he was able to feel out the individual threads that made up the weave of the sheet. He could easily smell past the lingering scent of antiseptic to the blood that had been spilt on the floor about 3 months before from a female diabetic patient. The slight smell taste of sugar in the blood gave it away. He sat up as his acute hearing picked up the heartbeats of 3 people outside the door. Focusing in on them, he picked up the scent of dogs, ozone, metal and blood, Inu. Metal, blood, slight antiseptic, and sword oil, Nako probably. And finally, tobacco smoke, ink and the slight decay brought on by age. The old man, no doubt. Quickly composing his face into a calm and serene look, he turned his head so that he was gazing out of the window in his room to a spectacular view of the village with the Hokage monument as a backdrop. He heard the sound of flesh gripping metal as the Hokage took hold of the door handle. Then the sound of metal sliding on metal followed as the handle was depressed. Finally, the hinges gave a near-silent squeak as the door was opened. Even with his eyes on the view outside, he easily picked up the moment when the Hokage noticed he was conscious, by the slight hitch in his breathing as well as the flutter of chakra resulting from being so surprised. Inu stared at the child sitting up in the hospital bed, whose gaze seemed to be fixed on the view outside. Privately, he allowed himself to breathe an internal sigh of relief, unnoticeably of course. He had a reputation to preserve after all. Finally, he could allow himself to relax from the high-strung state he had been in for the past 2 months. The record high of A-rank missions he had completed, a stunning 17 if he recalled, no wait, yes, one of those was a mislabeled S rank, had left the Hokage staring at him in slight concern whenever he reported in. As he turned to return to his post in order to grant the Hokage a private moment with Naruto, he silently vowed that when the time came, he would fulfill his duty to his sensei's son as he should have a decade ago. Sarutobi felt as though the world had just decided to take a break from resting on his shoulders. Seeing that little blonde-haired child sitting up brought tremendous relief that he was not even aware he desperately needed. However, quick on the heels of the relief was stomach-churning apprehension. He had long since accepted that Naruto had attempted suicide and that he would have to address just why he felt that was the only way out for him. He walked into the room, making sure not to walk silently as all ninja worth their salt unconsciously did. He even closed the door slightly harder than he usually did, all in an effort not to startle the poor child, completely unaware that said child was bursting his gut, trying not to erupt into belly-aching laughter. The Sannin decided to start off the inevitable conversation. "Hello Naruto-kun. It warms this old man's heart to find you awake again," he began gently. When Naruto turned and locked gazes with him, he unconsciously stilled as that piercing blue gaze caused flashbacks of another blonde-haired man's calm and confident soul-searing blue eyes. With a start he realized that something about the boy was different. Not just the aura about the child, for gone was the usual childlike, sunny and impatient disposition that used to cling to him, and in its place was a more tempered and calm aura, but his looks as well. Indeed, unless his aging eyes were deceiving him, Naruto's face was more defined now. Having lost most of its baby fat, and what little he could see of his body suggested he was taller and fitter than before his coma. In a quicksilver flash of intuition, he concluded that the doctors must have noticed that a steady diet of ramen had done no good for him and added some extra nutrients to the IV drip administered to him. It was a reasonable deduction and even half true, for when Naruto was improving his body, he did obtain the needed nutrients and other important proteins from the IV drip. His contemplation of the changed child only lasted a moment, and he continued his journey to the bedside seat. Naruto followed him with his eerily focused gaze, and when the old man had sit down, he opened his mouth and spoke in a smooth and even tone. "Gigi." The Sannin was startled once again in such a short time. Anytime Naruto had ended up in the hospital, he was always noticeably more exuberant than he was at the moment whenever he got a visit from him. Then he reminded himself that he could hardly expect the child to remain unchanged by the ordeal he had gone through. Naruto, who had easily followed the old man's train of thought, for he was never guarded around him, except when he asked about his parents or the reason for why he was treated as he was, had to stop himself from reacting noticeably as his theory was proven correct and any change in his behavior was put down to surviving his attempted suicide. Since he wanted to get over and done with the real reason that the Hokage was here, he said, "How long has it been since? How long have I been asleep?" Sarutobi noticed the change in Naruto's intended sentence, as he was meant to, and replied, "You have been here for 8 weeks now, Naruto-kun. Naruto-kun, can you tell me what happened? Did someone say something to you that made you sad? Did someone do something bad to you?" It was that last question that got a reaction out of him. Naruto blinked in carefully muted surprise at that. He wondered idly if this Naruto had suffered physical violence on his person, or maybe other forms of physical abuse. He immediately dismissed such dangerous thoughts from his mind. On the outside, however, he merely shook his head, and having already decided on how he should play this, he stated in the same calm and even tone he had been using. "Gigi, I was just tired. his short statement achieved its objective by leaving its meaning open to interpretation, essentially making the old man come up with an excuse for him without any effort on his part. And indeed, the Hokage did draw his own conclusions, believing that Naruto meant that the various actions and words of the vengeful and misled villagers towards him had finally gotten too much for him to bear. And really, who could blame the child? It was a testament to his tenacity that he had lasted as long as he had, and the Hokage liked to believe that it was a measure of Naruto's inherent goodness that he did not immediately turn to revenge as his way out. The Hokage never suspected a thing, for how could he? Simple and never been capable of deception when it mattered. The old man sighed and said, "I understand, Naruto, and I just want to say that I am always here for you, always." When he saw the child nod with emotion, gratitude, finally showing in his eyes, he allowed himself to fully relax and accept that Naruto was here, alive and well. He then said, "Well, the doctors have said that once you wake up, all that remains is a quick checkup and then you're free to go. While you were here I took the liberty of getting your apartment fixed up, and now that I see you have outgrown your clothes I can have some brought for you before you have to leave the hospital." Naruto smiled at him, not his usual goofy and too wide smile, but a more subdued and real one, and said, "Thanks, Gigi. I can't wait to leave here," and wrinkling his nose, he said, "It stinks." Sarutobi allowed himself to chuckle at the Naruto-ish complaint, somehow knowing that such manifestations of the bright and happy child he once knew would be rare occurrences from now on. He knew, in the depth of his two old bones, that Konoha had lost something that day 2 months ago, something that they would never ever get back. Naruto paused with the key in the lock, allowing his chakra to flutter in surprise, not because of the Anbu agent who had just sneezed, the agent whose presence he had detected as soon as he had stepped out of the hospital, but because of the fresh and clean walls surrounding his door, unblemished by creative and oftentimes repetitive graffiti. Shrugging, he stepped into his transformed apartment, absently noticing the reinforced ninja-grade locks on his door, and now that he was paying attention, the likewise reinforced and heavier door. He let out an amused huff. Got the apartment fixed up indeed. Standing in the doorway, he let his gaze pan across his obviously refurbished apartment, appreciating its new decor, from the new and modern appliances to the far more comfortable furniture. He stepped fully into his living room, ignoring the Anbu guard trailing him who just relocated to the tree beside his apartment building. On the topic of new things, he had to compliment whoever purchased the clothes he was wearing. His outfit, composed of a form-fitting dark blue long-sleeved shirt and black cargo shorts with steel-toed combat boots, was a definite upgrade from the orange monstrosity of yesteryears. They were very comfortable, although he didn't quite agree with their color scheme. He hadn't gotten too used to donning red and black and would have to see about acquiring some clothes similar to those he had worn in past lives. Perhaps he would even get back to wearing that face mask like Kakashi does. He sat on his couch and decided to finally tackle the main obstacle to his complete integration in this reality, and that was researching the history of the world. A seemingly inane thing to worry about, but he remembered once, many lives ago, publicly idolizing the Yondaime Hokage only for a mob made up of ninja and civilians to attempt to kill him. Much later, after he had reduced Konoha to a smoking and barren wasteland, he found out that the major change in this world was that Namikaze Minato was the Godem Hokage, and Orochimaru's successor. Moving on, he easily hatched a plan of action. He was aware that the tree outside his apartment afforded any skilled individual the ability to see into his living room but not his bedroom. So, under the guise of checking out the changes made to his bedroom, he casually walked inside it and seamlessly produced a cage bunshin without any evidence to give it away, making sure that the spike in chakra was the same as the one he let out in front of his apartment when he feigned surprise at the new decor. The Anbu outside never suspected a thing. While his clone hid in the bedroom, he wandered back out and eventually left his apartment with a book, which, going by the annotation in it, was left to him by Jiraiya as a birthday present. Not that the old Naruto would have been able to deduce what the scribbled signature of oil stood for. He made his way to the top of the Yondaime's head and sat down to read, easily sensing the Anbu guard settled down to read what was no doubt an orange book. Meanwhile, back at Naruto's apartment, the moment the cage bunshin felt his creator leave and the Anbu follow him, he set out to fulfill the task for which he was created. With no warning, his body smoothly shifted into that of an average-looking 10-year-old with perfectly ordinary features, brown eyes and hair. He left the apartment and made his way to the Konoha Public Library. He nonchalantly walked inside, politely greeting the librarian at the front desk, who smiled back at the polite young man. He asked her if she could point him in the direction of the history section, saying he needed reference books for his project on the timeline of the elemental nations. When the librarian expressed surprise at such a seemingly involved project for one so young, he admitted to her, with a sheepish smile, that his father had been trying to get him to pay attention in history lessons, and finally just decided to ransom a promised trip to the festival. He hoped that by doing the project he could convince his dad that he had turned a new leaf, so to speak. Chuckling at the impatience of today's youth for things like history, she pointed out the necessary section for him. The clone followed her directions and easily located various books written from different perspectives of ninjas and civilians alike. All told, a total of 6 relatively thick books. He set the books down at a desk and began reading. 15 minutes later he was done. He set the books back in their place and wandered over to the section set aside for the Ninja Academy. He speed read the various textbooks, easily deducing the syllabus for all the years of the academy as well as brushing up on the material taught. He had plans to skip a lot of days in the academy and was gratified to note that the final graduation exam accounted for 70% of a student's grade, for all their years in the academy. A dead last student could easily end up in the upper 25% of his year at the end of the day. Finally, the clone went to attend to his last task, the history of various wars and battles fought, as well as notable deeds of various ninjas. The purpose of reading about such was twofold. First and obvious was the fact that it would not do to be ignorant of so and so famous person who everybody knows, and whatever famous deeds they performed. Second, and more subtle, was the fact that reading about various famous deeds would give Naruto an idea of what people were capable of. For example, in some realities, space-time manipulation was never discovered, and so using jutsu like the Hiraishin caused far more trouble than it was worth. By the time the clone had finished, having taken some extra time to peruse books on forging, and geography, he had been in the library for 2 hours. He left, pausing at the front desk to thank the librarian, and left with a mischievous smile and a promise to bring her a souvenir from the festival. She laughed at his adorable cheek and waved him off. The clone walked out of the library and using a technique Naruto had created a long time ago when he got frustrated by the Kage Bunshin's limitations in terms of memory transfer. The clone sent a clump of its memories from the past 2 hours along the link that all shadow clones shared with their creator. The technique negated the need for a clone to disperse every time it wanted to share its experiences, thus adding significantly to the overall effectiveness of a clone during its lifetime. With that done, the clone walked down a deserted alley and vanished with no smoke, sound or trace, gone, between one moment and the next. The clone appeared in one of the deserted training grounds closer to the outskirts of the village. Indeed, as you might have guessed, he was in search of a suitable place where the original could train, somewhere well away from people and wibble risk of discovery. The training ground was not his final stop, however. He walked with a determined gait towards the trees that surrounded the forest, walking in a direction that would put him eventually at the wall surrounding the village. Before he could get that far, he emerged into a clearing. It bore the marks of area effect ninjutsu, evident by the various scorch marks, damaged equipment, felled trees, and in some places rust-brown stains denoting where blood was spilt. These clearings arose as a result of ninjas who wanted to test out some ninjutsu of the army killing persuasion. Out of courtesy, said ninja rarely ever experimented in official training grounds, not wanting to damage them and prevent others from making full use of them. The clone carefully memorized the location of the clearing and left to another part of the village to repeat the process. After 3 hours of searching, the clone had found and memorized the locations of a total of 11 such accidental training grounds, 3 of which had signs of use in the past year and were thus cut out of consideration. One of the potential training grounds had a waterfall, nothing too outrageously big, but more than sufficient for wind-natured chakra training among other things. Having accomplished all that he had set out to do, the clone disappeared without a trace, and this time for good. On top of the Yondaime's head, Naruto gave no indication whatsoever that he had received the memories of his clone. He smoothly stood up and dusted off non-existent dirt from his shorts. He sensed the attention of the Anbu on him as he stood and surveyed the village. Perhaps he is worried I might jump. He inhaled the clean and fresh air, held it in for a beat, and then exhaled. With one last glance at Konohagakure, he turned to return to his apartment. Arriving at his apartment once more, Naruto went about preparing a simple dinner. He made a mental note to read a cooking book in plain sight of one of his watchers before he began to prepare gourmet dishes. On that thought, he should probably start taking the chance to convince anyone watching him that he had taken up reading as a hobby. It was never fun when people started getting suspicious and watching him so close that it became a bother for him to cut loose and have fun. After all, he has found that people have the tendency to start giving him narrow-eyed looks when they discover he is a master blacksmith, hunter, tanner, tailor, chef, builder, artist. Well, you get the idea. The thing with living forever is that you have the time to do anything, and so eventually, you do. After eating and cleaning up, he went through the motions of getting ready for bed, and after securing his apartment he turned off all the lights, climbed into bed and went to sleep. A few minutes later, "Neko arrived to relieve me," said Kakashi as he finished his report of his day guarding Naruto. The Sandaime exhaled a stream of tobacco smoke and closed his eyes. Turning to one of his most prodigious Junin, he said, "Thank you, Kakashi." Noticing that his ninja seemed to have more to add, he inquired, "Is there something else?" Visibly hesitating, Kakashi finally sighed and said, "No, Hokage-sama." Giving him an assessing gaze, the Hokage decided to let it rest. "Very well, you may leave. Thank you for your good work." With a bow, Kakashi vanished from the Hokage's office in a cloud of smoke, and the old man turned back to his work, hoping to finish soon and go home. Moments earlier, the moment Naruto sensed the incoming chakra of Neko, he carefully molded his chakra in preparation, and when Neko arrived, causing a slight spike in her chakra, he burst into motion. He seamlessly and smokelessly created a cage bunchen beside his bed, and in the same motion switched out with clone and without losing a beat vanished from his apartment, all in the time it took the chakra spike of Neko's shunshin to die down, thus effectively masking his actions from detection by the two Anbu outside. Naruto materialized at the first of the 8 clearings he was going to convert into his personal training grounds. He created 10 highly charged shadow clones and departed for the next clearing. As Naruto left, his clones spread out, and by the time they had stopped moving, each clone stood in front of a tree. From above, the formation of the clones would have looked like a circle with 10 points placed at regular intervals. Moving in sync, each clone held up a finger and forged a small vivid blue chakra blade. Together, they began to carve seals into the trunks of the trees they stood in front of. Having already moved through all 8 clearings, Naruto arrived back at the first clearing and assumed a meditative pose to prepare himself for step 2. In all the 8 clearings, his clones were hard at work inscribing seals in increasingly complex patterns on 10 trees. Meanwhile, Naruto had begun his own portion of the task. Very carefully he gathered and molded a huge amount of chakra and kept a firm hold on it. Reaching out with his senses, he examined the chakra of the trees, plants and animals around him, essentially getting a read on the exact frequency, if you will, of the background chakra of the clearing. Then with absolute focus he began to mutate the nature of the chakra he had molded. Step by step, the chakra began to change from one that was unique to Naruto until finally it was indistinguishable from the chakra that saturated the surroundings. And right in time too, for he sensed through the link he shared with all his clones that they had just finished inscribing the seals. Now came step 3. Reaching out again, he grasped all 80 chakra links to his shadow clones and gave the shadow clones the go-ahead to do their parts. With the active chakra link between themselves, the clones were able to act in sync. Simultaneously, they molded all their remaining chakra into neutral-natured chakra, placed their hands on the seals they had just carved and activated the seals they had just carved, making sure to halt the activation process just before its conclusion, essentially leaving the seals in a state of suspended animation. Much like drawing a circle and stopping just before closing it off. Now for the most delicate part of the entire procedure, with his clones' minds right there with him, Naruto portioned the carefully prepared chakra into 80 equal parts, and after making sure that all his clones were ready, sent them out along the chakra links, with each chakra packet traveling at a speed that ensured that all the clones received them at the same time. As the clones felt the chakra packets arrive, without interrupting the flow, they fed the chakra into the suspended seals, and just as the last of the incoming chakra was sucked into the seal, they closed the loop, completing the charging and activation of the seals. Owing to the neutral nature of the chakra used, no ninja sensed the chakra spike, and the hidden nature of the clearings ensured that the resulting light show went unseen. After the chakra eruption had died down, Naruto dismissed all his clones. Getting up out of his meditative post, Naruto probed the newly made barrier around the clearing he was in, checking to make sure that all the features he had intended were present in the barrier and that nothing went wrong. He was satisfied with what he found. Now, no one but him would be able to find any of the 8 clearings, and even those who might have known about their existence in the past would just conclude that the trees must have regrown after they realize that they can't find any clearings outside the training grounds. After all, who knows what the trees grown by the Shoden are capable of? With all that done, Naruto could then get around to training up his body to flow smoothly with all the moves and reflexes he had acquired over his very long existence. It was always ultimately easier to have a body that didn't fight against ingrained reflexes and motions. Moving to the edge of the clearing, he flexed his chakra and suddenly 500 shadow clones existed in place. Checking to ensure that they would have enough chakra to see them through the night, he left them as they began grouping themselves into different squads, each of which would run through the katas of a different taijutsu style. He moved to the other shielded training grounds and repeated the same procedure, leaving clones that would acquire proper training in the use of the 5 elements, their various combinations as well as kenjutsu katas. With that done, he prepared to return to his apartment to get some rest. Now that he had taken care of all the necessary preparations, he could start having his fun. Just before he vanished from the clearing he was in, he watched a batch of clones juggle Rasengans amongst themselves and mused absently that he should build a blacksmith's forge in one of those clearings to make custom weapons, and then with not as much as a whisper, he was gone. From his perch in the darkness, 12-year-old Naruto could easily make out the 73 bandits that made up the camp, which was his target. His superior hearing picked up the whimpers and subdued crying coming from the tent pitched in the center of the clearing, where he knew the kidnapped women, girls, were being held captive. He had been going on such bandit clearing missions for months now. Knowing that the smaller villages in Fire Country often lacked military protection and were thus susceptible to bandit raids. So, he would sneak out of Konoha and go to those villages, offering his services for free. Of course, he sometimes had to explain to the people that he was more than capable of carrying out the mission, though he had found that simply fixing them with a look got things moving pretty quickly. Ever the meticulous one, Naruto performed last-minute checks before beginning what he had mentally termed Operation Wipeout. His self-made high-quality kunai and shuriken were all accounted for and easily accessible. His all-black fitted outfit was ready as well, no loose material to flap and give him away or hinder his movements. Finally, he used his chakra to probe the complex sealing array on the back of his hand, which was hidden by the black fingerless gloves he wore. Silence spread unnaturally fast through the clearing as all the normal sounds of the nighttime forest stilled. The bandits, quickly sensing the tense atmosphere, began to reach for their weapons. As the first man's fingers brushed the hilt of his sword, the very air in the clearing detonated with the force of a dying sun, instantly killing every single living human present. Not a single drop of blood was spilt, not a single sound was made, no flames, no lightning, no jutsu whatsoever was cast. 60 lives were extinguished by raw, ferocious and quite frankly, godly, killing intent. After Naruto had turned the bandits' bodies to ash and returned the murdered victims to their loved ones, he reflected on the mission, if it could be called that. Realizing that the level he was at could turn a simple face slap delivered in anger into a beheading strike, he set out to rectify the situation. Years ago, when he had lived the life of an Uzumaki clansman, he had heard of theoretical limiter seals intended to drag beings on par with the Biju down to the level of common ninja. These seals would be heads above the generic limiter seals, which merely limited chakra or provided resistance to physical exertion. No, these theoretical seals would have the power to infiltrate not just the chakra system of the target, but also the neural system as well. Their activation would lock away a stipulated portion of the target's chakra capacity, thereby both limiting the amount of chakra they have as well as their rate of chakra regeneration. They would also limit the rate of transfer of neurons along their neural network, resulting in slowed-down reflexes, loss of strength and a general diminishing of the target's capabilities and attributes. Under the effects of the seal, gods would be as men. It took 4 months of constant work using a veritable horde of shadow clones, but Naruto did it. He implemented 7 levels. Level 1, being the inactive state of the seal, to level 7 placing him on par with the better Junins of Konoha. He also designed the seal with a quick release mechanism allowing him to jump in levels with but a thought. The sight and smell before him caused his body to still and his eyes to turn flat and frigid. Peripherally he was aware that the captives he had come to rescue had drawn back from him in terror, but he could not bring himself to care about that at the moment. Turning back to the entrance to the tent, he spoke in a voice that impossibly managed to come out soft and soothing. "Elder Kayaba sent me for you. Please, stay here while I take care of the filth outside." Before any of the people inside the tent could utter a word, a clone had materialized beside Naruto with no prior warning, and Naruto stepped outside. Naruto touched his hand to the tent flap, and a shimmering blue wave passed over the tent, signifying that a combination sound and physical barrier had gone up. Inside the tent, the clone set about soothing and calming the captives as well as healing those who needed it using medical chakra. Naruto forewent using any method to disguise himself as he calmly and nonchalantly walked towards the main campfire. Some of the men in the camp had obviously noticed him, judging by the sound of swords leaving their sheaths as well as the malicious chuckles emanating from some of them. A huge bear of a man, obviously the bandit in charge, stepped forward and in a voice that indicated he was simply going through the motions addressed Naruto. "Hey Gaki, you lost? We could help you find your way back, but then again, you could just as well stay with us and entertain URK." Naruto flicked his ninjutsu to dislodge the blood clinging to it and watched dispassionately as the lead bandit bled out from the second mouth on his neck. The other bandits glanced fearfully at the place Naruto was standing at the start of the leader's speech, and only the quickest of them caught a glimpse of the fading afterimage left behind when Naruto moved at blurring speeds. Finally realizing that they were way outmatched, one of the smarter bandits turned to flee and collapsed only for his head to roll away from his body. The rest of the bandits had finally caught on to the situation they were in, and the camp erupted in chaos as most chose to run for their lives. 15 minutes later, it had all ended in a blur of black, gold and silver. Naruto had blazed through the throng, slicing through bodies, armor and swords as though he were performing katas in open air. His cuts were quick, clean and efficient, granting instant death to all he struck at. Even though the men were little more than despicable beasts, he would not reduce himself to making them needlessly suffer. Casting his senses around the encampment, he confirmed that all 72 bodies were accounted for. He gave an unnoticeable smirk as he turned to return to the captive's tent. His eyes widened as a blade erupted from his chest. He gurgled as the attacker ripped the blade free with a malicious smile on his unseen face. The smile was abruptly replaced with a grimace of pain as the body he still had a hold on dispersed with a surge of lightning. After his muscles had stopped twitching and he had regained mobility again, he spun in a circle, searching for his elusive prey. Naruto's calm and vaguely amused tone floated through the clearing. "I wondered when you would show yourself. It figures that trash like you would wait till the last moment to attack from behind." The mysterious assailant, a ninja no doubt, gave off a vicious snarl at Naruto's statement. In a tone filled with hatred attempting to mask the fear underneath, he said, "Why don't you show yourself if you think you're not trash, huh?" He immediately paled as he heard a chuckle from about a foot behind him. He spun, swinging his sword at chest height, neck height for Naruto, intending to end this fight quickly, only to find that his opponent, the Lee, much farther away. He quickly assessed the figure in front of him and was taken aback at the fact that the other was completely at ease. The first emotion he felt was fear that the person was so skilled that he didn't need to pay attention to him. However, fear quickly gave way to anger as the situation reminded him of the way people in his home village of Kumo had dismissed him as someone who would never amount to anything, and now, "I'm the leader of the biggest and most infamous bandit group in Fire Country." Well, I was at any rate. Seeing as he never ascended past the rank of Chunin, he had been unable to follow Naruto as he cut a swath of destruction through the bandit camp. His realization did not translate into caution, however, and he switched to an offensive stance and with no more discussion, sprang at Naruto. Naruto had been observing the ninja before him since the beginning and thus easily sidestepped his initial lunge. He made no motion to unsheath his ninjutsu from where it hung on his back, held in place by a subconscious application of chakra. He kept on dodging the swings of the enemy Chunin, moving only as much as necessary to have the attacking blade pass him harmlessly by. As time went on, the ninja's attacks got sloppier as frustration and fear emerged to slowly overcome the rage that had initially driven his swings. All through this, Naruto kept on dodging with the same calm and amused smile on his face. Moments later, he got a notification from his clone, informing him that all the captives had been successfully returned to their home village. "Finally, now I can finish up here and get back home." For the first time during the entire confrontation, Naruto reacted to the ninja attacking him. On his next swing, the enemy ninja found an obstacle in his path in the form of Naruto's silver-bladed ninjutsu. He only had time for his eyes to widen before Naruto sent a surge of lightning chakra down his blade, into the enemy's sword and then grounded via his body. The ninja's muscles spasmed and he let loose a pain-filled scream. Naruto cut off the flow of chakra to the weapon and watched the ninja fall to his knees. He locked gazes with his opponent and in one smooth and graceful motion, removed his head. After burning the ninja's body, he sealed his head in a storage scroll. He had memorized the bingo book and recalled a bounty on the Kumo Chunan's head. He searched the bandit camp for any loot and stored those in scrolls as well, intending to return most of it to the village the bandits had pillaged. He walked to the edge of the clearing and turned back to face the camp. Then he molded his chakra, stamped his foot and intoned Earth Release, Earth Land Flip, and watched as a square section of the ground roughly the size of the camp flipped over, leaving a bare and unblemished clearing where before stood the equivalent of a mass burial site. His work done with, Naruto vanished from the clearing with a flash of lightning and a rumble of thunder. Sneaking back into the village was as easy as ever. Naruto stealthily made his way back to his apartment door. He simply placed his hand on the door and pushed it open, having replaced all the locks with a complex, and sometimes lethal, sealing array. He took off his stealth clothes, pleased to note that there was not a single drop of blood on them. After cleaning up his equipment and himself, he got ready for bed. Tomorrow was the academy graduation exams and he had big plans. Ever since he returned to the academy after his reawakening, he had established a pattern of always missing Rin tests, ninjutsu practices, taijutsu tournaments, spars, as well as weapons accuracy tests. Having perused the syllabus of the academy as well as snuck in to view some of the files in the principal's office, he was well aware that it was possible for him to graduate the academy without having ever attended any of the above activities, and he was very much enamored with the idea of shocking everyone with his never-before-seen skills. Of course, Iruka had tried talking to him to get him to stop skipping school on those days, even going so far as to involve the Sannin Hokage. Between the two of them, it should have been a trivial matter to change Naruto's mind. The two found out, however, that no one could out-stubborn Naruto. After he pointed out that there were absolutely no consequences of missing those class periods, Iruka tried to mention that the skills developed during those classes were essential to graduation. Naruto merely gave the two an enigmatic smile and said, "Iruka-sensei, I will achieve the highest ever recorded score on the final graduation exam." Naruto had delivered that statement in such a straightforward and serious tone, his blue gaze solemn, focused and piercing, that the Hokage and Iruka had been struck speechless. After the silence brought on by Naruto's declaration, Sarutobi sat back in his seat and gazed thoughtfully at the young man in front of him. "Very well, Naruto." Silencing Iruka's protests before they could occur, he continued with a kind and proud look in his eye, "I believe in you." Picking up on the odd phrasing of that last statement, Iruka could say nothing else to that. Whatever it was the Hokage had seen as he gazed at Naruto must have been something, and indeed it was. For when Sarutobi had looked at Naruto, he was reminded of another blonde-haired man standing in his office, almost 2 decades ago, with the same determined and piercing blue eyes, declaring in the same solemn and confident tone, "Sarutobi-sama, send me. I will end this war." Some of the students already seated in the classroom turned at the sound of the door opening to find their most truant classmate walking in. As had been the case for the past 2 years, Naruto was dressed in his dark red muscle shirt, partial covered by an open black sleeveless jacket. He also wore black shorts, black steel-toed combat boots and a dark red face mask that covered everything below his nose. The first time Naruto had entered the classroom dressed like that, after awakening from his coma, not that any of the students knew that. Silence had quickly descended upon the children gathered in the room. True to form, Inuzuka Kiba had taken the chance to rib Naruto. "Hey dead last, nice threads. Your injury must have fixed your fashion sense, but I'm not sure it did anything for your lack of ninja skills." Even though there was nothing particularly witty about that statement, most of the other students still laughed because this was Naruto and that was what they did. Normally, the laughter would have been interrupted by an obnoxiously loud declaration from Naruto, protesting what Kiba had said and declaring that he would show them the greatness of the future Hokage, but it never came. At this deviation from the norm, people quickly focused on Naruto only to realize that he hadn't even paid attention to Kiba or the rest of the class. In fact, Naruto had never stopped walking and was already seated in the back of the room. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, Kiba threw out another taunt, intending to get a reaction from Naruto. Nothing. By this point, some of the other students had become uncomfortable and were shifting in their seats. Taunt after mocking taunt, and all Naruto did was sit there, calmly staring out of the window by his seat. Finally getting desperate, Kiba began. "And what's with that face mask? Finally realized that it must have been your ugly mug that caused your par," and he stopped. Wondering at what had interrupted Kiba, the students turned to look at him and found him pale and shaking, and even picked up faint whimpers emanating from his jacket where Akamaru was hidden. Quickly their gazes cut back to Naruto, and most of them shivered in fear. Naruto's eyes, that had once been calm and disinterested, were now frigid, deadly and unwaveringly trained on Kiba. After a few more seconds during which everyone held their breath, Naruto finally turned his gaze back to the window. It took a few minutes before people felt comfortable enough to repercussions, and even then, there was still an undercurrent of unease running through the room. At the start of the one-sided confrontation, Uchiha Sasuke had looked up in well-hidden interest. He had gotten bored when Naruto didn't react and returned to brooding, as he was often wont to do. When slightly frightened silence had descended, however, he quickly played back what Kiba had just said, and realizing that Kiba had been about to cross a line by mentioning Naruto's no doubt dead parents, he turned an angry gaze on him. A gaze that quickly turned surprised as he found Kiba looking like he had just seen a ghost. When he glanced at Naruto and noticed his glacial eyes, he had a brief flashback to the night his family was murdered, and a slight shiver of fear traveled down his spine. He silently berated himself for his reaction and made a mental note to pay more attention to the obviously much changed Naruto. A few minutes after the students had resumed talking amongst themselves, Iruka walked in and began the lesson of the day. Months after the start of the academy term and Naruto's memorable reintroduction to his classmates, the students of Iruka's class began to notice that Naruto never attended classes where they had ninja-based evaluations such as weapons accuracy tests, taijutsu spars, and so on. Grasping at something familiar and safe, they immediately began to speculate that Naruto, no matter the change in attitude and clothing, was still the same unskilled idiot, but only much quieter. You see, they chose to interpret his absences as him trying to avoid getting embarrassed by having his mediocre skills and inadequacies aired for all to see. So, now, not only were they convinced that he was a dead last loser, but also a cowardly one too. Sasuke had obviously heard such rumors, and with no evidence to say otherwise, having already forgotten Naruto's interaction with Kiba. Sasuke too was convinced that Naruto was nothing interesting and promptly went back to ignoring him. Naruto, who was aware of what was being said, simply ignored them, squabbling children playing at being ninjas, and continued to train and just generally do his own thing. Iruka finally arrived and the students quieted down in nervous anticipation. Quick on his heels was the assistant instructor, Mizuki, carrying in his arms the written portion of the academy exams. Iruka promptly began. "Well then, I see you're all quiet and eager for your exams, so we'll start right away. The exams will have 5 parts of 10 points each: a written exam, a weapons accuracy test, a stealth test, a taijutsu spar, and finally a ninjutsu evaluation. Now, as has always been the case, all portions of the exams save the written portion will have allowances for students to gain extra credit if they wish. As each portion comes up, I will let you know how the extra credit part works. Now, for these written exams, you have 15 minutes to answer all 100 questions correctly. Now, don't feel too bad when you can't answer everything in the time given. The exams are made to be unbeatable, and the record for this part of the exam has been held for over 5 decades by our very own Sannin Hokage." Many students broke out in hushed murmuring at that little tidbit. Smirking to himself, Iruka signaled Mizuki to hand out the exams, and when he finished, he gave the students the go-ahead to begin. Naruto glanced once through the exam and began filling in the correct answers without hesitation. Having lived for as long as he had and memorized the academy books on top of that, it was a trivial issue for him to know the answers. Coupled with his body's impressive speed and hand-eye coordination, he easily blazed through the written exams and finished a few minutes before the time was up. Iruka, noticing that Naruto was done, as did Mizuki, frowned in confusion. He knew how difficult the exams were, and though they were multiple-choice questions, they still took time to finish. Just what is the demon brat up to? Mizuki thought to himself. His plans were dependent on Naruto living up to his dead-last reputation and bombing the exams. He quickly calmed himself by thinking that Naruto must have either filled in absolute rubbish or just skipped a whole lot of questions. The plan was still on, and soon, Orochimaru-sama would bestow on him unimaginable power. At the 15-minute mark, the timer went off and Mizuki collected the papers for Iruka to start grading. A lot of the students grumbled about how they couldn't finish the exam and how most of them never got beyond the 70th question. Haruno Sakura, lauded as the smartest student in her year, turned to Iruka and asked, "Anyo, Iruka-sensei, you said that the Sandaime had the record for highest score in this portion of the exam, but you never told us what he scored." Iruka smiled at her and replied, "I had wondered when one of you would ask. I told you not to expect too much on the exam because the highest recorded score is an 89. Most of the students were visibly startled at that. Then Iruka continued, "Now, the next portion is the weapons accuracy test. I want you all to follow Mizuki, who will oversee the test while I get to grading your exams. I'm sure it won't take me long." Mizuki led the students outside to the weapons range. The range had 2 lines at a measured distance from the targets. The closest line was at 100 yards while the second was behind it, at 150 yards. The 10 targets were man-shaped cardboard cutouts with special red kill spots marked on them. Turning to the students, Mizuki began instructing them on the next portion of their exam. "For the weapons and accuracy test, I will call your name and you will step up and receive 5 kunais and 5 shurikens from me. You will stand at the 100-yard line and throw at the targets down the range. Your goal is to hit as many red-marked fatal points as possible. For each kill point you hit, you get 1 point. As Iruka mentioned, there is an opportunity for extra credit here. If you want to try for extra credit, you must step up to the 150-yard line and try to hit 10 of the kill spots with only the use of shuriken. Each point you hit properly grants you 2 points, but each one you miss costs you 1. So, if you try for extra credit and hit only 6 points, you get 8 points in total. Oh, and before I forget, the targets will be in motion for the extra credit part. Now, let's begin." Aburame Shino. Shino stepped up to the 100-yard line and, receiving the weapons from Mizuki, began to throw them one by one at the targets. He got 4 out of 5 of his targets using kunai and 3 out of 5 with shuriken. Mizuki noted his score down and called the next person up. This continued for a while, with all the students so far opting to forego the attempt at extra credit. Next, Mizuki called forward Kiba, who decided to try for extra credit. Strutting forward to the taunting calls of his classmate, Kiba accepted the weapons from Mizuki and stood at the 150-yard line. At this point, most of the class was quiet and focused on Kiba. Mizuki activated the mechanism that set the targets in motion and Kiba began. He threw the first 5 shuriken in quick succession and got 4 kill spots. The students watching cheered him on, and bolstered by his success, he got too cocky and launched the last 5 weapons faster than before and only scored 3 out of 5. Still, with a total score of 11 points, he was the current highest scorer. He threw a smug smirk at Sasuke and swaggered back to his place in line. The other students after him were encouraged by his success and started trying from the extra credit line. None, however, were able to do as well as Kiba until it was Sasuke's turn. The students immediately focused on him, and his fan club began to cheer him on. Sasuke calmly stepped up to the 150-yard line and accepted the weapons from Mizuki. He quickly launched 5 shurikens so close together that it seemed like he threw them simultaneously. To the amazement of the watching students, he got 4 out of 5, missing the last one only because the targets meant. Repeating the same thing with the last 5, he got the same score, putting him at the top of the scoreboard so far with a score of 14 points. Mizuki marked down his score, glanced at his board and called the next student, Uzumaki Naruto. Naruto nonchalantly made his way forward and received all 10 shuriken from Mizuki. He then turned towards the range, and as the students noticed he was making his way to the 150-yard line, they began to jeer at him, telling him not to bother making a fool of himself. Paying them no heed whatsoever, he stopped at the line, glanced at the targets and launched all 10 shuriken simultaneously. A single sound of metal shredding through cardboard echoed through the clearing, quickly followed by gasps of shock as the students noticed that each of Naruto's shuriken had gone through the red spot on the head of each of the targets. Silence spread through the clearing as the students and Mizuki attempted to understand just what they were seeing. A perfect score, using shuriken launched simultaneously at moving targets 150 yards away. Finally snapping out of his shock, Mizuki smiled and congratulated Naruto while internally seething at this new endangerment to his plan. Yamanaka Ino went next and, choosing not to attempt for extra credit, scored 7 out of 10. Mizuki finished tallying up her score and led the students to the next exam, the stealth test. Arriving at the obstacle course set up for the students, they discovered Iruka waiting for them. Well then, why don't we continue with the tests? As mentioned previously, this test allows you to get more than the allotted 10 points. The objective of this test is to make it through the obstacle course, bypassing all the traps and obstacles set up for you, and all without triggering any of the bells strung up in there. You will be graded on your speed and ability to make it through without using any chakra, triggering any bell or getting injured. Each student starts off with 15 points, and if you make it through in less than 3 minutes, without using chakra, ringing any bells or sustaining any injuries, you get to keep your full 15 points. Every 30 seconds after the 3-minute mark that passes, you lose 1 point. If you use chakra, ring a bell or sustain an injury, you lose 1 point. The record for this particular test is actually held by the Yondaime Hokage, who took 4 minutes and 19 seconds, and rang no bell to get a score of 13 points. When Iruka had mentioned the time limit, a lot of students began to think that the course would be relatively short and that they could easily make it through. Their hopes were ruthlessly crushed when he mentioned the Yondaime Hokage's time. If a legend like him could only get 13 points, then obviously the course must be insane. Iruka motioned Shino forward to begin and stepped back. Taking in a barely perceptible breath, Shino ran into the sectioned-off obstacle course, and since the students couldn't see what was happening inside, they all fell silent to listen carefully. 1 minute in, they heard a bell ring, followed by another about 45 seconds later. They noticed Iruka making a note in his scoreboard, undoubtedly penalizing Shino. The 3-minute mark passed and Shino was still nowhere in sight. Then 5 minutes after he went in, they heard the sound of a trap go off, and many surmised that he must have gotten injured. Finally, after one more bell rung, Shino emerged. A full 5 minutes and 27 seconds after beginning. He had one injury from a surprise trap and just barely scraped a score of 7 points. After Mizuki had reset the course, the next student went in. One by one, the other students made a pass at the obstacle course, with most getting times of over 5 minutes and 30 seconds and scores of 6, 7, 8, and in one case, 9 points, earned by Kiba. When it got to Sasuke's turn, the students once again gave him their full attention. When he started, they all focused, waiting to hear if he rung any bell or encountered any traps. After 3 minutes, people had begun to think that he might make it through without ringing a bell. Then at the 4-minute mark, they heard the distinct tinkling of a bell, quickly followed by another. Sasuke emerged after 4 minutes and 23 seconds without a single scratch on his body. He earned a score of 11 points. As Sasuke returned to his place in line, he threw a blatantly challenging smirk at Naruto, obviously still miffed by Naruto's performance in the weapons accuracy test. Naruto obviously caught the look, as did practically everyone else, then nonchalantly dismissed it as he walked past Sasuke to the starting line. This action did not sit well with Sasuke, who had to calm himself before he did anything unbecoming in such a public place. Sasuke's fan club did not hesitate to act in his place though, and quickly hurled insults at Naruto, loudest of all coming from Sakura and Ino. Blatantly ignoring them, and thus angering them further, Naruto glanced at Iruka to give him the go-ahead to begin. At Iruka's nod, he was off. The students listened and, despite Naruto's showing at the weapons range, most of them expected to hear bells going off as well as expletives. After the first minute they had heard nothing. Eyebrows were already being raised and disbelieving glances being shared. After 2 minutes and 58 seconds, Naruto casually strolled out of the exit of the obstacle course, not a single scratch on him, clothes unruffled and bells remaining silent. After Iruka had gotten over his surprise, he marked down Naruto's time and record-shattering score of 15 points. Calmly walking past a bewildered Uchiha Sasuke and gaping Inuzuka Kiba, Naruto returned to the tree he was leaning against before his turn and sat down on a raised root. Iruka called the last student, Ino, forward, and she finished with a score of 8 points. In his office, Sarutobi Hiruzen continued to watch the Ninja Academy exams using his crystal ball. He had been following the progress of Uzumaki Naruto and was pleasantly surprised by his success so far. It gladdened his heart to see Naruto realizing his full potential, even if he mentally made a note to discover just how he had improved so much. He glanced up as he heard his door open and watched as a handful of Junin, the future Junin senseis of the present graduating class, entered his office. Inviting them over to watch their future students' performances, he refocused on what was happening in the academy. After collating their results, Mizuki and Iruka led them to the taijutsu sparring grounds. Iruka turned to the students, most of whom were now eyeing Naruto with something other than scorn and haughty contempt, and began his instruction. Now, I want you to listen up carefully. The next portion of the exam is a taijutsu spar between you and Mizuki. The time limit for the spar is 2 minutes and your goal is to either defeat him or last the full 2 minutes. Each student will start out with 10 points and here's how the scoring will proceed. If a student wins before the time limit, by either knockout or knocking Mizuki out of the ring, then the amount of time left on the clock will be divided by 20, rounded down to the nearest whole number, and added to their 10 points for their final score. If a student loses before the limit, the same math occurs, but with a deduction from their 10 points for their final score. Once a student lasts past the 2-minute mark, they get their full 10 points whether they win or not. The record for this portion of the exam is a win in a time of 45 seconds, held by the Yondaime Hokage. Now, let us begin with Shino. Shino stepped impassively into the ring with Mizuki and at Iruka's signal, the spar started. From the get-go it was obvious that Mizuki was not going all out. For how could he, an academy student, could ordinarily never hope to match a Chunin? Using his higher-than-average clan-taught taijutsu skills, Shino was finally able to knock Mizuki out of the ring after 1 minute and 37 seconds, for a final score of 11 points. After congratulating him, Iruka called out the next student. And so it went, the stints Mizuki and only the clan children ever managed to win before the time limit was up, even if Mizuki went easy on them. For the civilians, most were able to last the 2 minutes, while the rest lost before it. Kiba, being the second best student in taijutsu, on paper, was able to win after 1 minute and 13 seconds. Eventually, Iruka called out Sasuke's name. Determined to be the best scorer in this portion of the test, Sasuke kicked it into high gear as soon as Iruka started the match. Noticeably moving faster than any of the other students before him, he engaged Mizuki in a ferocious taijutsu encounter. Landing more blows than he received, he ended the match with a brilliantly executed acrobatic maneuver that had his leg propelling Mizuki out of the ring after a hard impact to his chest. Iruka stopped the timer and noted his time of 1 minute and 2 seconds. Confident that no one would be able to beat his time, Sasuke exited the ring with a smug smirk and passed by Naruto, who was already making his way towards the ring before Iruka had even called on him. Back in the Sandame's office, some of the Junin expressed approval at the Uchiha heir's taijutsu prowess, commenting that he obviously must be the genius of his generation. Hitaki Kakashi, one of the Junin present, silently observed one of his future students with his one eye, before returning to his orange-covered book. Noticing the lack of commentary from his comrade, Sarutobi Asuma glanced over only to huff in exasperation at Kakashi's terrible habit. Not that he was one to talk, however. When the Junin noticed that Naruto was next, they paid close attention. That attention only sharpened further when Kakashi put away his book and focused on the crystal ball as well. Giving off an amused chuckle, the Sandame returned to gazing at the scene that was unfolding in the academy. Waiting for Iruka to finish recording Sasuke's time, Naruto calmly observed Mizuki standing opposite him, taking particular notice of the well-hidden malice in his eyes. Knowing that Mizuki would probably not hold back in the first few moments of their spar, he prepared himself to crush the traitor swiftly and ruthlessly. The other students, Sasuke in particular, quickly focused on the spar that was about to begin, hoping to see if Naruto's previously hidden skills included taijutsu as well. Mizuki just wanted to kill 2 birds with 1 stone and diminish Naruto's chances of graduating while getting to beat him down. The moment Iruka gave the signal, Mizuki was off. Blurring across the arena, faster than any of the other genin could ever hope to follow, he appeared in front of Naruto, his right fist already rocketing towards the boy's head. So confident was he in getting in the first strike that he overcommitted to the blow, and so, when his hand passed through the space where Naruto's face used to be, he found that he had overextended himself. Before his brain could put together what the lack of impact meant, his body was already folding over the right knee that Naruto had plowed into his stomach. Blood left his mouth as Iruka and the students watching gasped in shock when they noticed the foot-sized crater created where Naruto had pushed of the ground. Naruto's leg came back down just as physics caught up to Mizuki, whose body had begun to leave the floor. It was not to be, however. Naruto's right hand was suddenly gripping his hair as he drove his head back down to meet the left knee that he had just raised. The spectators winced when a crack resounded through the clearing, quickly followed by blood spraying out of Mizuki's nose and mouth as he slipped into blissful unconsciousness. Numb fingers clicked the button on the timer and Iruka slowly gazed at the clock's face. 3 seconds. A low whistle left the mouth of one of the Junin gathered around the Hokage's crystal ball, followed by an amazed, yet quite accurate, observation. Now, that was a smack down. The Hokage chuckled and puffed out a cloud of tobacco smoke as he thought to himself, Kushina, he really is your son. The Hokage had obviously noticed that Mizuki had started off too strong for just a taijutsu spar and made a mental note to keep an eye on him. Kakashi, who had also noticed that Mizuki's intentions were less than pure, watched with vindictive pleasure as the idiot slumped to the ground in a bleeding and broken mess. Serves him right for pulling a stunt like that. The students had begun to whisper as soon as Naruto had been declared the winner by knockout. Many of them were wondering just when the supposed dead last had gotten so strong and why he had kept on avoiding assessment tests during the academy school year. Sasuke, meanwhile, was mentally reconsidering everything he thought he knew about Uzumaki Naruto and making plans to corner him for questioning later. Back on the sparring field, Iruka had propped Mizuki against a tree and used what little battlefield healing jutsu he knew. Since his partner was out for the count, he faced off against Ino himself, winning the spar after 1 minute and 50 seconds. After the students had gotten over their shock at seeing the dead last demolish their teacher, Iruka herded them back into the classroom for the final portion of the exam. Being that it was a fairly straightforward process, his instructions were short. You hear your name, enter the next room and do what we tell you, and when you're done, move on to the room across from you and wait for the rest to finish. He started with Shino as always, and continued down the list. Mizuki, who had recovered, joined him halfway through. Sasuke walked in when it was his turn and then Naruto's name was called. As Naruto made his way towards the connecting door, his acute hearing easily picked up what was being said in the room that contained those who had already finished their exams. Smirking to himself at successfully stirring up the hive, he entered the connecting room to see the 2 instructors seated at a table. He walked to stand in front of them, absently noting that the hatred in Mizuki's eyes was more visible, probably due to his humiliating injuries. Smiling proudly at him, Iruka spoke. Well, Naruto, you've gotten to the last portion of the exams. This ninjutsu test is fairly straightforward. You will be tested on the use of the basic 3 jutsu, the Kawarimi, Henge and Bunshin no Jutsu. We will begin with the Kawarimi. Now, sometime in the next 15 seconds and with no prior warning, Mizuki will launch a blunted kunai at you, which you must obviously avoid by switching out with something else. Extra points will be given for demonstrated mastery of the jutsu. The 15 seconds starts now. Naruto had kept his cool gaze on Mizuki throughout the speech given by Iruka and thus easily made out the lust for vengeance that brightened his eyes when Iruka mentioned the surprise blunted kunai. Fully aware that Mizuki would attempt to get him back for his previous humiliation, he subtly went on alert for any tricks, while appearing calm, unconcerned and wide open. 9 seconds after the official start of the testing, Mizuki launched a kunai with no prior warning at Naruto, whose eyes easily tracked it, even if it was traveling far faster than a genin could handle. The kunai traveled the gap in an instant and, to the horror of Iruka and barely hidden glee of Mizuki, it plunged into Naruto's chest. Iruka watched devastated, as Naruto's eyes widened in pain and his body began to fall backwards. He was on his feet in an instant, about to rush towards Naruto, to give whatever futile aid he could when Naruto's body burst into smoke and revealed a chair with the kunai sticking halfway out of it. It took a moment for Iruka to understand what he was seeing and he slumped in relief. A chuckle behind him had him turning to see Naruto standing there with an amused air about him. In the Hokage's office, the present Junin allowed their muscle to relax once they realized that Naruto had successfully performed the replacement technique. most noted with interest that the Kawarimi had been pulled off without any hand-see of mastery only found in high-level Chunin ninja and above. After he had calmed his heart rate, Iruka turned to berate Mizuki for using what was obviously a real kunai. Mizuki acted sheepish and was able to somewhat fool Iruka into believing that it was a simple oversight on his part. He even apologized to Naruto, who wasn't fooled for an instant. Mizuki was aware that at this point, Naruto had already passed his graduation exam. So, he privately began to revise his plan for stealing the Forbidden Scroll of Sealing. After things had calmed down, and Iruka had marked Naruto extra for performing a seamless Kawarimi with no hand seals and with enough mastery to leave a decoy afterimage, he resumed with the tests. Good job on the Kawarimi, Naruto. Now, you simply have to henge into another person, and then create at least 3 clones. With only a nod, Naruto's form simply shimmered, and in his place was the Sannin Hokage in full Hokage robes and his pipe in hand. As the figure before them looked up, Iruka and Mizuki subconsciously straightened when they met that ancient and penetrating gaze. Calmly, the figure of the Sannin breathed out a small stream of fire and lit his pipe. Taking a few puffs, he exhaled some tobacco, which Iruka could smell, and spoke in the mellow and soothing tones of the professor. "How are you, Iruka-kun?" For an instant, Iruka was about to reply as he had always done when the Sannin asked after him, but then he reminded himself that this was Naruto under an eerily realistic henge and said, "Very good, Naruto, that's another sealless, smokeless and obviously mastered jutsu. At this point in time, you already have passing marks, but if you want to continue, you can attempt to create at least 3 bunshins." Once again, with neither smoke nor sound, the room was suddenly containing 10 Narutos placed at regular intervals in a circle around the room. Looking around, neither Iruka nor Mizuki were able to determine which one was the real Naruto. Chuckling as he wrote in his clipboard, Iruka awarded Naruto full marks with extra credit for mastery of the 3 Academy Jutsu. He then said, "Okay, Naruto, you can disperse them now." 9 Narutos, including the one standing where the original had been, faded out of existence without a trace. Turning in surprise, the instructors found the original standing at the back of the room, obviously amused at their surprise. Shaking his head, Iruka said, "You never cease to amaze me, Naruto." Then beaming with pride at him, Iruka tossed him a Hite 8 and told him, "You pass, Naruto, with distinction. Congratulations." Smiling at him, Naruto caught the Hite 8 and bowed to the 2 teachers. He made his way out of the room and to the room across him, where the students who had finished were waiting. When he walked in with his Hite 8 displayed on his forehead, none of the students were surprised anymore. Naruto had apparently already desensitized them during the earlier tests. Naruto sat at the back as he often did, and about 10 minutes later, Ino entered with her own headband, followed by Iruka and Mizuki. Iruka beamed at the students and began his closing statements. "Well, it's all done now. Though some of you might not have done as well as you expected, I am still proud of the progress you have all made. Those of you who couldn't make the passing grade can retry next year. I have full faith that you will be ready by then. For those of you who received your Hite 8, you have my congratulations. Make sure to be here tomorrow morning for team assignments." And without further ado, the announcement I know most of you have been waiting for. The Rookie of the Year. This year, the Rookie of the Year position is awarded to Uchiha Sasuke for a consistently outstanding performance throughout his attendance. Most of the students applauded, having already expected as much, with members of the Sasuke fan club screeching loudly. After calming them down, Iruka continued. "There is still one more thing to take care of, however. Uchiha-san earned the title of Rookie of the Year because all 6 years of schooling were taken into account. Taking only the graduation exam into consideration, however, the results are quite different. I will now list the top 3 students with scores in each of the exam sections. Inuzuka Kiba, with scores of 6.7, 11, 9, 12 and 11, earned a total of 49.7 to come in 3rd place. Kiba immediately cheered at doing so well in the exams, ignoring his terrible score in the written portion of the exam. Some of the people around him congratulated him while others pointed out that his accumulated score must be terrible to be able to offset his high exam score. At the observation, he flushed and grumbled while others laughed. The students eventually turned back to Iruka, who continued. Uchiha Sasuke, with scores of 8.1, 14, 11, 12 and 13, earned a total of 58.1 to come in 2nd place. Most of the girls in class cheered at Sasuke's high score, before quieting down as they realized that someone had obviously scored higher than him. Many of the students reached the proper conclusion about the identity of the first-place winner at the same time and turned to gape in shock at the person they had derided as the dead last for the past 6 years. Speaking into the bewildered silence, Iruka announced Naruto's score. Uzumaki Naruto, with record-shattering scores of 10, 20, 15, 15 and 15, earned the highest possible score of 75 points to come in first place. Naruto is now the current holder for highest score in every portion of the graduation exams. Congratulations Naruto, and to the rest of you as well. I will see you tomorrow. And with the rest of the class gaping at the disinterested Naruto, Iruka and Mizuki departed from the classroom. Naruto stood up and meandered outside as well, while the rest of the students looked on in stunned silence. The sound of the door closing behind him roused them from their stupor, and Naruto smirked as he heard a cry of outrage and shock that originated from Kiba. Chuckling to himself, he vanished from the hallway, disappearing as though he were never there. In the Hokage's office, the Junin who had been watching the performance of their students missed Naruto's disappearing act because, by then the Hokage had ended the jutsu that allowed them to view the classroom. Turning to his Junin, Sarutobi prepared to begin the meeting he had originally called them for. He mused to himself that things were obviously about to become very interesting. Naruto watched the sun rise from the top of the Yondaime's head. Taking in such clean air and listening to the birds sing in the morning always invoked feelings of nostalgia in him. Contrary to what they say, the world for him had ended, and began, not on a stormy night, but on such a peaceful morning. Now, as he gazed over the slowly awakening village, his mind recalled a time far in the past, hopefully never in the future, when Konoha was just a blackened spot on the map, and where the resurrected Uchiha Madara had finally captured him. Naruto fought and struggled against the chakra bonds that held him in place. He screamed and raged as Madara finished extracting the Hachibi and dropped the rapidly cooling body of his friend, mentor and brother in arms. He turned his gaze away from the corpse and the approaching Madara to watch the remnants of the shinobi allied forces standing, helplessly, outside the barrier that Madara had set up. When they had first arrived, intending to rescue Killer Bee and Naruto, they had thrown everything they had at the barrier, only to watch in horror as the chakra fueling their rescue attempts was absorbed by the barrier, strengthening it further. Madara had just scoffed disdainfully and turned to begin the extraction. Now he stood before Naruto and started weaving the hand seals that would begin the tug of war between Naruto and the Gedo Mazo, where defeat was certain death. Smiling in anticipation of possessing the Kyuubi and finally remaking the Jubi, Madara completed the hand signs and began the prestigesting hand of purple chakra touched Naruto, his body, his world, his very reality became pain. The scream that was wrenched from his throat was so soul-searing that it sapped the strength from Tsunade's bones, leaving her to slump in sorrow and anguish as she watched the last thing that still mattered to her get his soul shredded to sat a madman's thirst for power. Through the haze of pain, Naruto became aware of the chakra bindings failing under the force of the chakra being exerted. With his reconnection to his chakra, the very thing that was being ripped out of him, his pain increased tenfold, 100-fold, 1,000-fold even. He felt his very soul being pulled apart as the Gedo Mazo attempted to remove the Kyuubi, only to discover that the two beings were too tightly bound. One would go nowhere without the other. When the Yondaime had sealed the Kyuubi in Naruto, he had invoked the power of a being outside mortal comprehension. The act of sealing a half of the Kyuubi inside the belly of the Shinigami killed two birds with one stone. He was able to lock away a portion of the Kyuubi's power forever, but he was also able to bring the death god forth to attempt what no man had ever attempted before, to utilize a portion of a god's essence to shackle an immortal creature to a mortal child's soul. Indeed, people lauded the genius of the Yondaime while only being aware of less than half of what he had accomplished that night. Even when Jiraiya and the Sandaime had examined the seal on Naruto, they were unable to see beyond the admittedly complex surface design of the seal. Thus, they missed the part of the seal that held a portion of the Shinigami's power, which held the main containment seal together and bound the Kyuubi's soul more tightly to Naruto's own. So, when Madara attempted to extract the Kyuubi from Naruto, he was attempting to separate two souls that had been bound as one by the power of a being that existed in the space between spaces, in the moments between seconds. Madara, for all his vaunted power and legendary status, was as a child playing with forces beyond his limited human understanding. The chakra of the Gedo Mazo had latched onto the Kyuubi and begun to pull. Naruto's soul obviously resisted the extraction, much like one would resist another's attempt to pull off one's arm. Somehow, Naruto was able to finally fight through the world-devouring pain he was in and pull back against the force behind the extraction process. The knowledge that his life was not the only thing at stake gave him an inner strength that was beyond any he had ever possessed. Madara felt the resistance and panicked. The surrounding shinobi dared to hope as they watched Madara flare his chakra as though he were fighting against a steady force. And indeed, that was what he was doing. Noticing that the progress of the extraction process had slowed to a crawl, he joined his chakra to the statue hoping to boost it. Naruto gritted his teeth as he felt the strength behind the opposite pull increase tremendously. Because he had been fighting for so long, he was at less than half strength. Knowing that very soon his current strength would fail against the combined might of Madara and the other 8 Biju powering the Gedo Mazo, he attempted something that he had only theorized about all those years ago when he had learned to utilize natural energy. The main principle behind successfully molding natural energy was keeping a steady balance of natural, physical and spiritual energy in the core of the individual. This requirement of constant balance is what limited the amount of sage chakra that could be molded at any given time. The amount of physical and spiritual energy the individual possessed determined how much natural energy they could mold to keep the balance. For someone with obscene amounts of chakra, like Naruto, the amount of sage chakra he could mold at a time could boggle the mind. However, after a few years of using shadow clones to mold sage chakra and then transfer said chakra to him when he ran out, he set out to find a better method. His determination led to him learning how to mold sage chakra while in motion. It was however not the solution he had originally envisioned. Natural energy was the energy of the earth, the chakra of life itself, and as such, Naruto believed that it was as close to infinite as one could ever get. This notion arose from the fact that it was practically impossible to use up that much chakra before more was regenerated. With that in mind, he came up with a theory. If he could absorb enough natural energy to create a stable balance and then begin to absorb, in a steady amount, more natural energy while simultaneously utilizing the same amounts of natural energy from his core, he could take advantage of the infinite nature of natural energy. Essentially, he would be using up the natural energy in his core just as fast as he would be replenishing it, while keeping the mixture of 3 energies in perfect balance. He believed that natural energy, being neutral, could be controlled to do things normal chakra couldn't, such as resisting the attempted theft of one's soul. He had never tested his theory, but here, with his soul being torn asunder, it was as good a time as any. Fighting through the haze of pain he was in, Naruto began to draw on the natural energy around him. Energy that had always been in a relatively surplus amount in Fire Country, owing to the numerous trees and animals littering the land. Madara roared in anger as he felt the pull on the Kyuubi reverse direction. Turning his attention to Naruto, he found a calm young man with a serene look on his face, where before there had been a body thrashing in the grasp of unfathomable pain. He was just about to force out even more of his chakra when he glanced up in momentary surprise, causing his concentration to flicker for an instant before he recovered his focus. Tsunade had been watching from her position slumped on the floor, watching as her combination son and little brother in all but blood got his very soul torn apart. She stirred from the tempest of anguish and loss that had ensnared her when she noticed the change in the mood around her. A glance revealed what the matter was as she noticed the peace and calm on Naruto's face. When the pulling motion of the chakra hand originating from the Gedo Mazo slowed to a stop, she rose to her feet. When the pull actually began to reverse, she took a step forward, hope and wonder beginning to shine on her face. When she noticed Madara about to act in retaliation for whatever Naruto was doing, she made up her mind. Knowing that she was about to gamble, and quite probably lose, she sprang forward with her clenched fist blazing with chakra. With the roar of an enraged mother bear she punched the barrier, producing a deep sound much like striking a gong. As the barrier's chakra absorption ability kicked in and attempted to absorb the chakra in her punch, she released the chakra in one burst just as she normally did for her super punches. When the shinobi forces had first attempted to break the barrier, she noticed that the absorption of chakra happened at a gradual pace. What she had done was try to force feed it more than it could handle in such a short time. The barrier flickered. Madara glanced up in surprise. The chakra feedback from her stunt blasted Tsunade away, with fatal wounds. Madara's concentration faltered for a heartbeat. It was enough. Naruto gave an almighty pull, The Gedo Mazo lost. Nothing was ever the same. The moment Naruto felt Madara hesitate, he pulled with everything he had, and like an elastic band, the portion of his soul in the grasp of the Gedo Mazo snapped back inside his body. But his soul was not the only thing that came back. He had neglected the fact that the Gedo Mazo had a firm hold on his soul, so when he dragged the Kyuubi back in, the chakra of the Gedo Mazo, and the 8 Biju with it, came along for the ride. Naruto had just unknowingly done what Madara had intended to do to himself. Everyone watched in the last of the Gedo Mazo's chakra disappeared into Naruto. All was still, as though the entire world had just taken in a deep breath. Then the stillness was shattered as Naruto threw his head back and howled. As the chakra of the 9 Biju and the Gedo Mazo merged inside his core, the balance of natural energy and body chakra was thrown out of whack, and so, Naruto subconsciously compensated and began to take in more natural energy. He absorbed increasingly larger amounts of natural energy until he had enough to match the raging chakra in his core. The problem with this was that when the chakra in his core combined, it resulted in chakra equivalent to a primordial being. The Jubi. Often called the 10-tailed god, the Jubi was credited with creating the world and all life in it. So, when Naruto tried to balance out that chakra with natural energy, he had to absorb everything the world could give, essentially absorbing the equivalent of 2 godly beings. It was too much power for a single human soul to contain, and as Naruto's very existence threatened to burn out, the Shinigami got involved. The chakra present inside Naruto was trying to negate his existence, trying to cast his very soul into oblivion. Yet, that very soul had been touched by the essence of death. A being for whom oblivion does not exist. Contradictions could not be allowed in reality, and so Naruto had to be removed from existence without his existence being compromised. Only one solution presented itself, and thus Naruto became more than human, more than merely mortal. He became the eternal sage. The actual process of transcending his mortal limits happened both in an instant and for an eternity. Since the laws of the reality Naruto existed in demanded that a mortal soul be unable to exist with so much power contained in it, the essence of the Shinigami dragged Naruto somewhere where such laws held no sway, into the space between spaces, and the moment between seconds, into the place where the death god ruled. There, Naruto experienced eternity as the powers he had absorbed integrated themselves inside him, bonding to his very essence. Under the onslaught of so much raw power, all that he was, all that he had ever been was erased. Uzumaki Naruto died, for the eternal sage to live. After the sage had acclimated to the influx of power and the shared experiences contained in the essences of the Biju, he departed from the place of his rebirth, and as though taking a step, he was suddenly standing at the spot where he had previously laid. All this had happened in the time it took to blink. In an instant everything had changed. Madara took a few moments to take in what he was seeing. Just moments ago, the Kyuubi Jinchuriki had absorbed the newly made Jubi, his Jubi, and was in the process of burning out, quite literally. Now, the meddlesome child was standing there looking at him as though he were a particularly fascinating insect. He was Uchiha Madara, and he would not be trifled with. Madara locked hate-filled eyes with the otherworldly blue gaze of his adversary and spat out, Amaterasu. The sage blinked at the roaring black flames bearing down on him, and they simply ceased to be. Madara refused to allow himself to stop to consider what just happened. He clapped his hands and a forest burst from the ground, reaching forward to destroy his opponent. The sage tilted his head at the incoming trees, and they turned to dust, dispersed on the wind. Enraged beyond any measure, Madara summoned Susanoo and wove 3 hand seals, then screamed out, Tengai Shinsei. Knowing what the jutsu did, the remnants of the shinobi allied forces glanced at the skies in time to see 3 meteorites breach the atmosphere, one after another. Many began to panic as the first meteorite rapidly descended to the spot where they stood. The sage stood still as the meteorite got closer and closer, and when it was seconds away from impact, he merely raised his hand and extended his finger. Jaws dropped as the meteorite stopped abruptly, with the other 2 stacking on top of the first. With a sigh, the sage flicked his finger, and with a sonic boom, the meteorites exited the planet's atmosphere. Suddenly, the sage was standing in front of Madara, but before he could react he found his throat in an unyielding grip. Madara tried and failed to access his chakra and escape. He struggled in the grip of the being in front of him, much like Naruto had struggled in his chakra bonds earlier on. Madara paused in his struggles as he felt a stirring in the depths of his body. His eyes widened as the source of the feeling became clear. Once more, the remnants of the Shinobi Alliance forces watched in stunned shock as Madara began to scream, much like Naruto had been screaming when the Gedo Mazo attempted to extract his soul. Quickly connecting the dots, they watched as Madara eventually stilled and his resurrected body crumbled to dust without his soul to inhabit it. The sage turned and many avoided his gaze, unable to meet the eyes of the newly born primordial being before him. His eyes finally settled on the barely breathing body of Senju Tsunade, and in a blink, he was kneeling next to her. Something faint within him told him that the human lying before him was important to him, and he decided to heed it and simply touched her cheek. Before the disbelieving eyes of everyone present, Tsunade's wounds healed up and even her chakra levels were restored. Looking at the man beside her in relief and deep fondness, she asked, "Naruto? Is that you, Naruto? Are you really Naruto?" The sage wondered if Naruto was his name. Yes, he thought to himself, Naruto, Uzumaki Naruto. No, Namikaze Uzumaki Naruto. Yes, that was it. He was Namikaze Uzumaki Naruto. And with that, the sage remembered. Smiling softly at her, he replied, "Hey, you shouldn't be pulling such dangerous stunts at your age, Ba-chan." Laughing, with tears flowing freely from her eyes, she grabbed him in a hug, and just like that, it finally dawned on everyone watching that the 8-year-long war had just ended. Cheers erupted everywhere as people grabbed their comrades in hugs, crying tears of joy and relief tinged with sadness. It took years, but the world eventually recovered, not completely, but enough. Throughout that time the sage lived on, not aging, until time had run its course and turned everything he knew into dust. After finally learning how to navigate the paths between realities, the eternal sage moved on, replacing any of his counterparts who had been lost to the flow of time for one reason or the other, with time becoming his only companion. Naruto was startled out of his memories by the dispersal of one of his clones. Shaking his head to get rid of lingering memories, he stood up, dusted his shorts and gazed once more at the peaceful village laid out before him. Smiling to himself, he vanished in the direction of the academy for his team assignments. Let the games begin. The people who were present at the entrance to the academy that morning were able to witness Naruto materialize, already in a smooth walk, in front of the academy. Some of them actually allowed themselves to acknowledge how cool he looked, arriving in such a fashion. Casually making his way inside the academy, Naruto ignored the muted whispers from his peers and the others standing around the school's entrance. No doubt news of his performance during the graduation exams had already spread. Naruto arrived at his assigned classroom and entered to find that he was the first one there. Shrugging to himself, he proceeded to the single seat at the back. Having no intention of ending up seating next to Sasuke and thus suffering the horrendous voices of his fan club. Deciding to kill some time, he took out the tale of the gutsy ninja and began to read it, again. His sharp senses detected the approach of a few classmates, and thus he didn't even twitch when the door opened to accept 4 people into the room. The sounds of dragging feet and chewing preceded Shikamaru and Choji, while the muted sound of buzzing heralded the entrance of Saint was from a civilian family and, from what Naruto had observed, would probably end up being cannon fodder down the line. Shikamaru, Choji, and Shino took the seats in front of Naruto, who hadn't looked up from his book since their entrance. Shikamaru threw a quick and considering glance at Naruto, then just shook his head and mumbled, "Troublesome." Shino, on the other hand, actually turned and addressed Naruto. "Congratulations on your success in the graduation exams, Uzumaki-san." Naruto finally looked up at that and giving an eye smile to Shino, he replied. "Thank you, Aburame-san. As I recall, you also did quite well, so congratulations to you too, and please feel free to call me Naruto." "Thank you, and the same to you too." Both of them returned to their previous positions, Naruto reading his book and Shino seating calmly. By this time Shikamaru had already dozed off, while Choji just continued munching on his chips. Over the next few minutes, the class slowly filled up with the successful academy graduates. When Sasuke entered, he cast a briefly assessing gaze at Naruto before taking his seat in the middle of the room. Naruto's sensitive hearing easily picked up the approaching footsteps of 2 students, and judging by their voices, he correctly deduced their identities. A few seconds later, Haruno Sakura and Yamanaka Ino burst into the room, obviously having just finished sprinting to the academy, Then began their customary arguments and competition for the seat next to the Uchiha. Iruka came in before they could settle their argument and cowed them into submission. Naruto glanced up as Iruka came in and smiled as he noticed the absence of Mizuki. The fool was most probably enjoying the hospitality of the T&I department at the moment. He returned to his book, only peripherally aware of the various team assignments being read out by Iruka. Seeing as he wasn't the dead last this time around, he absently wondered whose team he would be. And Uzumaki Naruto. Your Junin-sensei is Hitaki Kakashi. Well then, that answered that. He wondered what convinced the old man to place him on the same team as the top 2 students in his year, until he remembered that as far as the Hokage was concerned, Naruto had attempted suicide a few years ago. Well, that would do it, he mused to himself. After banishing his thoughts, and noticing Iruka's closing statements and subsequent dismissal for lunch, he returned to his reading. Hours later, only the 3 future members of Team 7 were still seated inside the classroom, waiting for their Junin-sensei. Sakura had spent the past 2 hours trying, and subsequently failing, to get Sasuke to go on a date with her. After a particularly vehement denial, she decided to take a little breather, much to the Sasuke's well-hidden relief. She turned her attention to the 3rd member of her team and was surprised to note that he hadn't moved from the spot where he had been reading for the past few hours. Now that she was paying attention to him, she allowed herself to take him in fully. She recalled the time when he used to constantly follow her around, asking her for dates and making her feel so good about herself. No matter how annoyed she had felt at the time, the constant attention and adoration had bolstered her sometimes flagging self-confidence. However, ever since he had missed school for about 2 months, things had changed. At first, when she noticed that he seemed to be ignoring her, she brushed it off, fully expecting him to get back to pestering her. It never happened. It took some time, but she eventually came to realize that Naruto simply didn't care about her anymore. It was a surprisingly bitter pill to swallow, but swallow it, she did. She cast a glance at Sasuke, and seeing the closed-off expression on his face, she decided to sit quietly by herself until their sensei arrived. Sasuke breathed an internal sigh of relief when Sakura finally ceased bothering him. He noticed the glance she threw at the corner and turned to see Naruto sitting there, reading his book. He was almost startled to notice that he had forgotten that there were 3 people waiting in the classroom. Now that he had noticed his last teammate, he remembered his desire to find out more about him. Never one to beat around the bush, he addressed him directly. Hey, dead, Uzumaki, how did you do so well on the exams if you missed so many important classes? Sakura perked up at the question and turned back to Naruto. She too was curious about his previously unknown skill. Without taking his eyes off his book, Naruto distractedly replied. Did you ever consider that I chose not to attend those classes because I didn't need them? Sasuke blinked at Naruto's response. He concluded that Naruto must have meant that he got training outside the academy, thus negating any need to attend the practical academy classes. Still curious, he continued his inquiry. And who did you get help from? At that, Naruto finally glanced up from his book, and fixing Sasuke with a disinterested look, he retorted. Help? Why would I need an instructor when I am fully capable of reading? Sasuke found it hard to believe that Naruto had learned all that from scrolls, but before he could continue his questioning, the door was thrown open. He turned in surprise, noticing from the corner of his eye that Naruto was obviously not startled. In the doorway stood a tall gray-haired ninja wearing a face mask very similar to Naruto's. He even had a book in hand. The ninja, obviously their Junin-sensei, ran a bored gaze across the room and spoke in a lazy tone. My first impression of you is that you're boring. Meet me on the roof in 5 minutes. In a cloud of smoke, he was gone. Sasuke glanced at Sakura, then glanced at the empty seat where Naruto used to be. His eyes widened when he realized that Naruto had somehow vanished from the room without his notice. Huffing out a frustrated breath, he left the room, making his way towards the roof. Hitaki Kakashi suddenly felt eyes on him and casually glanced up from his book. He had to fight down a twitch when he noticed his blonde-haired student calmly staring at him. When the hell did he get here, and how didn't I notice? He saw the amusement in Naruto's eyes and narrowed his eye at him. In response to this, Naruto in turn fixed Kakashi with a narrow-eyed gaze. Sasuke and Sakura arrived on the roof to find their teacher and teammate engaged in a staring contest. As the 2 kids drew near, Sakura cleared her throat. In an eerily synchronized motion, Naruto and Kakashi turned to face the two of them and eyes smiled in unison. Fighting off creepy shudders, they took a seat on either side of Naruto and all three turned to face Kakashi. Deciding to get the ball rolling, Kakashi began. Well then, why don't we get started with introductions? I'll go first. My name is Hitaki Kakashi. My likes are not your concern, nor are my dislikes. My hobbies and dreams, well, you're much too young to know those, Kakashi concluded with another eye smile. Motioning towards Sakura, he indicated for her to go next. She started. My name is Haruno Sakura. My likes are glances at Sasuke with giggles and stifled squealing. My hobbies are rinse and repeat. I dislike Ino pig. And my dream for the future is to glance, cue ear-piercing squeal. Sasuke and Kakashi shook their heads to clear the residual ringing, only to notice Naruto removing earplugs from his ears with laughter in his eyes. Almost sulking at the betrayal, Kakashi indicated that Sasuke was next. Sasuke began in a solemn tone. Uchiha Sasuke, I don't have many likes nor dislikes, and my hobby is training to get stronger. My dream for the future, no, my ambition is to revive my clan and kill a certain man. At the end of his speech, Sakura was gazing adoringly at him while Kakashi was giving him a thoughtful look that expertly hid the frown he wanted to show. Naruto was reading his book. After getting over his surprise at just how indifferent his blonde-haired student could be, he motioned for Naruto to go next. As he was completely aware of the blatant interest on Sakura's face, as well as the hidden interest on Kakashi's and Sasuke's faces. You may call me Uzumaki Naruto. I like the colors red and black. I dislike the color purple. My hobby is music, particularly playing the violin. Kakashi perked up at that surprising tidbit, as did Sasuke and Sakura. Naruto paid no attention to their reactions, however. He instead fixed all three with a suddenly fierce and determined gaze that caused all of them to subconsciously straighten and pay attention. My dream for the future, no, the reality of my future, I will become the greatest shinobi this world has ever known. The rooftop was silent for a few moments after Naruto's declaration, which sounded like a foretelling. Kakashi finally broke the silence after observing his sensei's son for a few moments and decided to wrap things up. Very well then, meet me on Training Ground 7 tomorrow at 6 a.m. for a survival test that will determine whether or not you become my genin or return to the academy for remedial training. Oh, and I suggest you don't eat any breakfast. You'll only throw it up. See you. In a cloud of smoke, he was gone before any of them could respond to his statement. Sasuke narrowed his eyes, determined to pass whatever test came his way the next day. He glanced to his side, only to discover that Naruto had once again vanished without him knowing. Gritting his teeth, he immediately shot down Sakura's offer of a date and departed for some training and preparation. Sakura, completely crushed by Sasuke's rejection and feeling anxious for her test tomorrow, also left the rooftop. The sound of incoming footsteps forced Sakura out of her daytime fantasy of being Sasuke's wife. Looking up, she was just in time to witness the figure of her blonde-haired teammate enter the clearing a whole 3 hours after they were told to arrive. She inhaled, preparing to lambaste her tardy team member when she was cut off by a casual statement from her intended target. So his 3-hour lateness is a regular thing, good to know. Stunned, and feeling especially foolish for arriving so early, she quieted down and turned away from him, thus missing the amusement shining in his azure eyes. Sasuke merely grunted, refusing to acknowledge that he should have thought of the same thing. Naruto simply walked across the clearing to a tree on the other side, sat down, took out his book and began to read. He was fully aware of the contemplative looks being thrown his way by the other 2 members of his future team. Completely ignoring said looks, he prevented any amusement from showing on his face when he heard the near-silent huff of frustration from Sasuke. Just as Sasuke was about to resume his interrogation from the day before, their late sensei showed up in a puff of smoke. Kakashi merely smiled as Sakura screeched her indignation to the high heavens, causing Sasuke to twitch. When her voice had ceased echoing, he calmly took out his earplugs and tossed a thumbs up at Naruto, who was failing to muffle his chuckles. Before Sakura could react to that insult, Kakashi's countenance became serious, prompting the 3 before him to pay attention. He raised 2 silver bells in one hand and began his instructions. The objective of this survival test is to acquire at least one of the bells you see in my hand. You will have until noon to accomplish this task. Anyone who fails to get a bell will be tied to one of the stumps in the clearing and will be denied lunch. Furthermore, the one who didn't get a bell will fail this test and will subsequently be sent back to the academy for another year. Now, begin." His instructions left no room for argument and his prospective students vanished into hiding in the surrounding vegetation. Kakashi spared a second to evaluate their stealth. Sasuke is well hidden, certainly undetectable to anyone Chunin and below. Sakura, on the other hand, isn't too bad, but nothing like a top kunoichi should be. And Naruto is still standing in front of me. Giving his final student a vaguely perplexed look, he said, "You are an odd one. Shouldn't you be hiding like those two?" Naruto merely glanced at him, then returned to his book. Blinking in muted surprise, Kakashi decided that the kid had the right idea and promptly produced his own literature to begin perusing. He crouched in position, oddly more comfortable that way, and continued reading. His sharp hearing picked up approaching footsteps and he subtly went on alert, preparing for any surprise his enigma of a student could have. Instead of attacking, however, Naruto merely walked past him and stopped, and then he too crouched and rested himself lightly against his teacher, and continued reading. Feeling oddly amused by the cheek of his student, he let him rest part of his weight on him, all the while keeping a watch for any attempt on the bells tied to his belt. A handful of minutes later, Sasuke obviously got impatient and launched his attack. A couple of kunai were launched from Kakashi's left and instinctively, he shifted to move out of the way. His blood ran cold as he suddenly realized that his movement had thrown his other student off balance, thus making it very likely that Naruto would get hit by the kunai. Without even thinking about it, he spun and scooped up his sensei's son and blurred away from the incoming attack. He spared a moment to ensure that his student was fine before he took off to test his black-haired student. So preoccupied had he been with getting Naruto out of harm's way that he had failed to notice the faint smirk that curled on said student's lips, nor the fact that said student had demonstrated a complete mastery of the Kawarimi no Jutsu. Kakashi instead vanished from the clearing, too fast for any but Naruto to see. Sasuke, who had swiftly changed positions after his failed initial attack, remained crouched on the branch he was on. He quickly threw a punch to his left, only for it to meet his sensei's palm. As though that were a signal, the two burst into a quick and fluid taijutsu exchange. Kakashi ended it by tossing Sasuke away when his hand got close enough to actually touch one of the bells. His eye, however, widened when he noticed the hand seals being woven by Sasuke. His surprised expression never vanished even as a huge fireball leapt the intervening distance between them. When the smoke had finally cleared, Sasuke noticed that nothing remained of his teacher. Looking to the sides and above for him, he was taken off guard when hands erupted from the ground and proceeded to drag him under until only his head remained above ground. Sasuke glanced up in time to watch his teacher disappear with naught but an eye smile thrown his way. Sakura had decided to circle around to Sasuke's position the moment she saw the kunai launched at Kakashi. Ignorant of the noise she made as she moved through the brush, she emerged in a smaller clearing. Looking around to orient herself, she suddenly dove into some bushes, praying that her teacher hadn't noticed her. She peeked out of hiding and sighed in relief when she noticed him still leaning against a tree. Kakashi meanwhile hid a smile at his pink-haired student's adorable naivety. Sakura, rightfully doubtful of her chances against a ninja of Kakashi's caliber, turned to stealthily make her way in the other direction. She heard a rustle in front of her and glanced up into the smiling eye of her teacher. She gasped and recoiled in shock, only to lose sight of him. Looking around frantically, she turned at the sound of a voice coming from the right. Knowing who owned said voice, her face broke out into a relieved and smitten smile as she prepared to meet her Sasuke-kun. The smile fled from her face as she saw Sasuke drag himself into view. His remaining leg bent at an odd angle, fingers missing and blood leaking from numerous wounds on his body. Unable to face the vision before her, she clenched her eyes shut, let loose a scream of abject terror, and slumped into unconsciousness. Musing absently to himself, Kakashi wondered if he had oved the thought away. He returned to the clearing and promptly stumbled in surprise when he found his third student still casually reading his book. Moving towards him, he opened his mouth, intending to admonish his lazy student, only to have to duck a sudden airborne spinning kick aimed at his head. Before his eye had finished widening, he promptly switched places with a log in time to avoid getting hit by a ball of lightning fired by a clone originally behind him. Finally getting a moment to orient himself, his head snapped up at the sound of a page being turned to find Naruto still in place reading his book. He furrowed his brows at that and nonchalantly tossed a kunai at his student's head. Naruto simply caught it by its ring and returned it at twice the speed, forcing Kakashi to shift out of the way of the approaching kunai. Hidden in the shadow of that kunai was another one with an explosive tag attached to it, which Kakashi only saw at the lost moment. Once the resulting explosion had settled, he stepped out of the place he had switched to and closely regarded Naruto, still sitting there and reading. "Well, you're better than I expected. I might actually have to start taking you seriously." Naruto let loose a chuckle and stood up facing his teacher. In another eerily synchronized motion, they both slipped their respective books away and prepared to engage one another. Kakashi started off with a blurring punch aimed at Naruto's torso. Slapping the attack aside, Naruto retaliated with a lightning-coated jab to Kakashi's face, smoothly shifting it into an elbow jab and then a rising knee as Kakashi deflected each subsequent attack. They continued in a swift and fluid taijutsu exchange, with Kakashi pleasantly surprised at Naruto's ability to keep up with the pace he was setting. Finally, believing his student to be wide open, Kakashi slammed a kick into an airborne Naruto, only to clench his teeth as lightning coursed through his body from the dispersed lightning clone. He mitigated the damage using his own inherent lightning chakra and pivoted on the spot, fluidly catching and returning the 5 shuriken launched at his back. Quickly forming hand seals, he called out, "Shuriken Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, Shuriken Shadow Clone Technique," and the 5 shuriken became 100. Naruto inhaled deeply and then blew out a chakra-laced gust of wind while saying, "Fuden. Renkuden, wind release, drilling air bullet." The wind bullet slammed the shuriken off course and continued on to Kakashi, who responded with a wind bullet of his own, canceling out Naruto's attack. Kakashi glanced up as he heard, "Raiso. Ikazuki no Utage, lightning burial. Banquet of lightning," and witnessed Naruto stomp his foot on the ground. He jumped into the air as lightning raced along the floor towards his position. In midair, he was unable to react in time as Naruto faced him and calmly intoned, "Raiden. Raryu no Tatsumaki, lightning release. Lightning dragon tornado." Launching a tornado of lightning at Kakashi. The attack impacted with Kakashi and exploded in a surge of lightning. All of a sudden, a kunai was placed along Naruto's jugular and Kakashi lazily spoke. "You definitely have some smooth moves, but you still have a ways to go." Naruto merely glanced at him from the corner of his eye and chuckled. Confused at his student's reaction and completely sure that he wasn't holding a clone, he asked, "Care to share what amuses you?" It was then that he felt the cool length of Naruto's ninjutsu resting with its tip poised a hair's breadth from his chest and crackling with tightly leashed lightning chakra. He couldn't help it, he threw back his head and laughed. When he got over his fit of amusement, he disengaged from Naruto just in time for the alarm clock he set to go off, indicating that the test was over. Shaking his head at his most surprising student, he left to fetch the rest of his team. When he arrived at the 3 stumps in the clearing, Sasuke and Sakura in tow, he found Naruto sitting on the middle stump with his book in hand. In a blur, he had Sakura tied to the leftmost post and a gag in her mouth to spare his sensitive ears. He turned to take in his students and pronounced, "Well, you all F." The sound of bells tinkling cut him off and he slowly turned to Naruto, who was still reading, but in whose second hand was held the 2 silver bells. Suppressing the shock that threatened to show on his face, he asked, "Ho, and at what point during our little dance did you steal those?" Naruto raised an eyebrow at that and said, "During the dance? Never, I actually just stole them from you when you were tying Sakura up there." Seeing the confusion on their faces, hidden in Kakashi's case, he continued, "At the beginning, when you were being my knight in shining armor, I filled the bells with chakra, the first step to initiating a successful Kawarimi, and then just now switched them with the chakra-laced air next to me." Silence met his explanation and he looked around to find Sasuke and Sakura looking stunned. Kakashi, with a detectable note of approval in his voice, said, "Very well done, Naruto, very well done indeed. Now, seeing as you have 2 bells, which of the others will you give one to?" Naruto gave off an amused huff and with a flick of his wrist, Sakura was free of the ropes binding her, and before either she or Sasuke could react to that, he flicked one bell at each of them, which they caught reflexively. Turning to Kakashi, Naruto said, "Your instructions were to obtain a bell, not necessarily maintain possession of it once we did. So, since I have obtained a bell, and so have Sasuke and Sakura, I guess we all pass." Kakashi, seeing the dawning hope on Sakura's face, merely chuckled and replied, "Nice try, Naruto, but I remember saying that you had until noon." Naruto, still looking calm and unruffled, spoke, "That's true, and I'm sure if you look at the clock, you will find that someone had changed the alarm to go off about 20 minutes earlier." Blinking in shock, the others looked at the clock and noticed that Naruto was indeed correct. Noon was in 6 minutes. Giving Naruto a contemplative look tinged with exasperated fondness, Kakashi finally said, "Okay then. I could pass you on that technicality, and I will, only if one of you can tell me the main purpose behind this test." Looking a little perplexed at that statement, Sakura offered up an answer. You wanted to gauge our levels, sensei?" The look on Sasuke's face said that he agreed with Sakura, and so he frowned when Kakashi shook his head. Catching the look on Sasuke's face, he passed him over, correctly deducing that Sasuke had the same thing to say as Sakura, and turned to Naruto for his input. Naruto once again got that look in his eyes that made those listening to him lean forward in complete attention. In a solemn tone that cut through the sudden stillness, he gave his own answer. "You are a Junin-level ninja, Hitaki Kakashi, reputably the strongest current Konoha shinobi excepting the Hokage. There is no way that a bunch of fresh academy graduates would stand a chance against you. You wanted to gauge our ability to function as a unit, as a team, as one. You wanted to make us learn that we are rarely, if ever, stronger individually than we are together. After all, those who abandon their mission are trash, but those who abandon their comrades are worse than trash." Once more there was silence after one of Naruto's declarations. This time, however, it was a thoughtful one, filled with burgeoning feelings of camaraderie and team spirit. After getting over his surprise, Kakashi stared at Naruto and realized that he had never seen such a stunning resemblance between Naruto and his sensei as he did in that moment. Sitting there with the wind in his sun-kissed golden hair and his eyes, such a focused and clear blue, Naruto cut a striking figure indeed. Smiling contentedly to himself, Kakashi finally broke the silence. "Yes, that is entirely correct. Those who abandon their mission are trash, but those who abandon their comrades are worse. A tenet I live by, and the tenet I hope you will all come to live by in the future. Congratulations, you all pass. Meet me on the bridge tomorrow morning for our first official day as Team 7. Kakashi watched his team's interactions from his perch in the tree. His presence was so muted that only Anbu-level ninja and above could have possibly detected him. Still knowing that, he found himself unsurprised when Naruto flicked a brief and almost unnoticeable glance in his direction. Noticing that he had a few minutes before he had to make his entrance, he allowed himself to muse on the 2 months that had passed since the formation of Team 7. He was simultaneously both amazed and stumped by the dynamic which existed between his 3 students. He was amazed because he had never seen, never even heard, of such an efficient team. Their mission's rating, so far, averaged a staggering 98%. What stumped him, however, was that regardless of how successful their mission history, there was nothing even remotely resembling teamwork between them. Kakashi knew that Sasuke felt threatened by Naruto's heretofore unseen proficiency. It took 1 sparring session and 2 minutes for Kakashi to accept what the bell test had hinted at. Naruto was heads and shoulders above his peers. Hell, the kid was heads above some chunin in the village. Sasuke repeatedly got frustrated any time he had a spar with Naruto. No matter what moves he pulled out, whatever clever tricks he thought he had up his sleeve, Naruto remained unruffled and undefeated. Compounding the issue was the fact that Naruto clearly had no interest in becoming Sasuke's rival. The only time that he ever agreed to spar with him was during team spars, when Kakashi would ask him to. The sheer disinterest set Sasuke's teeth on edge, forcing him to give his all in every encounter they had, all for naught. Kakashi remembered, a few weeks after passing his team, when he asked Naruto who had taught him taijutsu. You see, he asked because the boy's taijutsu style was almost like nothing he had ever seen. Being friends with a taijutsu expert like Maeda Guy ensured that Kakashi was well educated on a variety of taijutsu styles. Every time he sparred with his student, he noticed that his moves were like variations of standard taijutsu katas. It was almost like listening to a different dialect of a language he knew well. When he asked Naruto for the identity of his taijutsu teacher, the answer he received perplexed him. Naruto had replied, "I learned from life, I guess. From the striking snake and the stalking tiger, from the leaping monkey and the hunting wolf, from the flowing river and the turbulent wind, from everything around me, from life." Kakashi had wondered at what his student meant. He could never have known that Naruto was actually telling him the truth. Centuries into his eternal existence, after he had learnt and mastered all the taijutsu styles that existed in whatever reality he found himself in, Naruto sought to go deeper. He visited mountain monasteries, looking for the ancient monks who had discovered the art of taijutsu. From them he learned the history of taijutsu and its origins. He learned how the first of them had observed the way the animals and environment around them had behaved. He learned to watch how the relentless yet fluid motion of a river wore away the immovable rock in its path. He learned to observe as the wind went from peaceful and calm to ferocious and cutting in an instant. He went back to the source and learned it all. The result was a taijutsu style that comprised of the strengths of each style, all refined to their purest forms. Much like with Chinese whispers, the passing down of taijutsu styles from generation to generation introduced additions that resulted in the final form being changed from its original ancestor. Hence the reason why Naruto's moves seemed similar to some of the styles Kakashi was familiar with. He was seeing the taijutsu styles in their pure and unchanged form. Nonetheless, the fact remained that Naruto was at a level that put him permanently out of reach of his teammates, though Sasuke refused to believe that Naruto would always be the better shinobi. In his spars with his blonde student, Kakashi always won of course, but doing so always required more effort on his part. However, after a handful of spars, he had realized that even though Naruto always lost against him, he almost never took a hit. At first he had wondered if his memory was just faulty, but after the next 3 spars, he realized that he was right the first time. Concerned that he was being too easy on his student, he started to kick their spars into high gear, at about mid-Chunin level, and noticed that Naruto began to sustain a few more injuries. So, every time he sparred with Naruto, he fought him at a level noticeably higher than he did with Sasuke. Which Sasuke noticed of course. Still, even fighting him at a more demanding pace, Kakashi still suspected that Naruto wasn't giving it his all, but he had no proof of it and so dismissed his suspicions. Sasuke had spent the past few minutes staring at his other male teammate standing at the railing on the bridge, staring at the water passing by underneath. It had been 2 months and still he was no closer to surpassing Naruto. It irked him something fierce that a no-name like Naruto was so far above him in terms of skill that he couldn't even touch him in their spars. What was even worse was that Naruto always looked unruffled, no matter what Sasuke threw his way. Sasuke had taken to perusing the hidden jutsu library located in the Uchiha clan compound. He practiced some of the D-ranked and C-ranked fire jutsu, hoping to find something he could use against his teammate. Nothing ever worked. He would launch a fireball at Naruto, only to be forced to dodge his own fireball combined with a wind bullet. Somehow, Naruto was always a step ahead of him and it annoyed him greatly. He kept trying to unlock his Sharingan, fully confident that Naruto would be no match for him then, but was having no luck there. Putting aside his thoughts on the matter, Sasuke turned his gaze away from Naruto and stared into space. It had been a long 2 months for Sakura, and things did not seem to be looking up. After Kakashi had passed them as a team, she felt as though her dream had finally come true. She was on a team with her Sasuke-kun and nothing was ever going to come between them again. Her dreams were ruthlessly shattered during the first spar she had with Sasuke. She had managed to convince herself that he wouldn't actually fight her. Her delusions had lasted up until a spinning kick from him had slammed into her face, knocking her out. She woke up to find herself sitting by the side of the training ground and no Sasuke worrying over her. No, he was instead involved in a spar with Naruto, which he was losing. Still, she managed to repress that incident somehow and went back to being a fangirl, albeit a slightly more subdued one. As more and more rejections from Sasuke piled up with no buffering declarations from Naruto, she found herself less and less able to summon up the same feelings of adoration she once held for Sasuke. Over time, she slowly became less enamored with him and began to think for herself. She also began to pay more attention to the lessons Kakashi attempted to teach them. She had improved somewhat, and now, she was at the level of a proper academy graduate and not just a civilian. Regardless of her change in attitude, she still had moments where she would forget herself and revert to her former behavior. If she were honest with herself, she would realize that her change to a slightly more serious kunoichi was still related to her desire for Sasuke. Having spent so long with him, she had come to understand that there was almost nothing Sasuke hated more than weakness. Therefore, her taking her kunoichi skills more seriously was rooted in a desire to finally have Sasuke acknowledge her, yet her efforts were for naught. At first she was confused, until she noticed that every time Sasuke would always stare at Naruto. She could tell that it was Naruto's apparent skill which surprised and annoyed Sasuke. Still, she couldn't see past her jealousy and slowly, bitterness began to fester in her heart. She threw a slightly malicious look at Naruto, who was still staring at the river which flowed underneath the bridge. Kakashi shook himself out of his thoughts and noting the time, prepared to make his entrance. He saw that Naruto was having one of his rare moments of introspection and as such had his guard down somewhat. Kakashi timed his attack perfectly. Without any warning signs whatsoever, he was suddenly standing beside Naruto, his leg already in a smooth sweeping motion and his hand jabbing forward. Naruto had been completely aware of Kakashi's presence and thus he could have avoided what happened next if he wanted to. However, in keeping with Kakashi's intended result, Naruto was flipped over the railing he was leaning against, and splashed into the river below. Sasuke and Sakura both felt petty vindication at how wet Naruto was when he finally emerged from the water. With an eye smile, Kakashi stated, "That's a good look on you, Naruto." Naruto froze for a moment, and then he slowly turned towards Kakashi and smiled at him. With the feeling of lead in his stomach, Kakashi remembered who it was he had just pranked, Konoha's #1 prankster. Kakashi shook off his dawning feeling of terror and turned to head towards the mission office to obtain a mission for his team. From the corner of his eye, he noticed Naruto make a hand seal and channel chakra-heated air along his body to dry himself off. Shaking his head at his ever-surprising student, he returned to his thoughts. He had finally decided to take his team on their first C-rank mission. He was fully aware that the only reason he felt comfortable doing so was because of the amount of faith he had in Naruto's skill. He was confident that if anything came up, Naruto would be able to get his team out of it, and if he couldn't, well, he was not called Sharingan no Kakashi for nothing. With that final thought, he returned to his ever-present Icha Icha novel and continued to walk towards his destination. Naruto calmly walked behind Kakashi and in between his other two teammates. Since the making of Team 7 2 months prior, he had been aware of the feelings of his teammates towards his person. Not being a vindictive person by nature, he never went out of his way to exacerbate the situation, but he wasn't one to roll over for anyone either. He found that after living for so long as he had, it was practically impossible to care about the bruised and battered egos of little children or the petty jealousy inspired from puppy crushes. One ray of sunshine, though, was his relationship with his sensei. It felt kind of nice to have an older brother figure in him, one who he could horse around with from time to time. He realized that the incident from 2 years ago must have played a part in scaring Kakashi out of his indifference. Regardless, he quite enjoyed the interactions he shared with Kakashi. His fondness for Kakashi notwithstanding, he was going to get him back for his actions that morning. So, as they approached the door to the mission office, Naruto cast his senses out to confirm that Iruka and the Sandaime were present, along with quite a number of other shinobi. Showtime. As Team 7 approached the door, Naruto shifted his gait to make it seem as though he were attempting, and failing, to conceal a limp. Before Kakashi or any of his other teammates could wonder at that, they entered the mission office and immediately drew the gaze of the Sandaime. Sarutobi's sharp eyes had easily picked up the inconsistency in Naruto's stride, and taking into consideration the boy's phenomenal healing factor, he knew that for Naruto to still be limping now, he must have sustained a grave injury indeed. With barely detectable concern, he asked, "Naruto, are you all right?" Naruto glanced up with wide blue eyes, looking like a deer caught in headlights. He then promptly blushed to the roots of his hair and began to fidget, in place. With rising concern on the Sandaime's part and slowing dawning horror on Kakashi's, Sarutobi leaned forward with furrowed brows. By this point, Iruka had also noticed that something was wrong and he too focused on Naruto. Naruto opened his mouth, and in a coy and shy tone, he said, it's just that, it was my first time doing that with a man of his caliber. Pin, drop, silence. Sarutobi's face looked to be carved out of granite, and Iruka's eyes had the dawning light of intended murder in them. The rest of the shinobi present had paused what they were doing and focused on what was happening. Noticing that he now had the full attention of the entire room, Naruto had to fight to maintain his innocent facade as he wove his magic. Late yesterday, when we were doing it, Kaka-sensei and I, it was slightly painful since it was my first time doing that. At this point, Kakashi was staring dumbly at his blonde-haired student, his book hanging limply from his fingers. Peripherally he was aware of the rising killing intent emanating from the Sandaime and Iruka, as well as the increasing amounts of suspicion and contempt in the gazes of his fellow shinobi. For all that, he could do nothing but stutter out. "What, you, Naruto, what are you talking about?" Naruto looked down and twisted his fingers in his shirt, blatantly ripping off the moves of a certain shy Hyuga princess. He glanced at Kakashi from the corner of his eye and his face flushed further. He then looked up and gained a dreamy look in his blue eyes which combined with his flushed cheeks presented such an entrancing image that people watching could see how Kakashi might have done that to him. Never one to stop while he was ahead, Naruto twisted the knife further. With a dreamy tone to go with the look in his eyes, he continued. "Yesterday, the movement of our bodies, the repeated thud of flesh hitting flesh, the grunts and pants of exertion, the sweat and smell from such physical activity, feeling him all over me, telling me how good I looked wet, and the pleasant ache that told me I was going to be deliciously sore the next day. Kaka-sensei was a little rough, but I liked it, it let me feel it properly." At this point, some people were discreetly wiping off bloodied noses. Sakura had turned bright red in the middle of Naruto's recounting and Sasuke had a blush suffusing his face. Almost simultaneously, the two glanced at Kakashi and shifted away from him as though he were about to pounce and do that to them as well. The sound of a pipe being broken by a too strong grip cut through the silence in the room. Slowly and carefully, Kakashi turned to look at the Sandaime and instead found the Kami no Shinobi staring back at him. Before the Hokage could leave his desk and extract Kakashi's entrails via his nose, Iruka was on his feet, glaring murder at Kakashi and spat out. "Naruto, are you telling me that this person touched you yesterday?" Like a switch being thrown, Naruto was suddenly back to his usual calm and aloof self. Before the room could fully adjust to such an abrupt change in demeanor, Naruto smoothly replied. "Of course he did, Iruka-sensei. It's kind of hard to avoid physical contact during an all-out spar." Then with an amused twinkle in his eye, he continued, "Why? What did you think I was talking about?" The entire room practically face-faulted. They all looked up at the sound of a shutter clicking to find Naruto gleefully taking numerous pictures of Kakashi's pale, gaping, and stunned visage. The silence that had descended was suddenly broken by muffled snickers from the eternal Chunin pair, Kotetsu and Izumo. Like a dam giving way, the entire room erupted into laughter at Kakashi's expense, with even the Hokage chuckling to himself, and to think that I thought that Naruto had given up his mischievous ways. After the room had quieted down some, loose every now and then, Kakashi collected himself and trying to act like nothing happened, stepped forward to request a C-rank mission for his team. However, he internally vowed to get his blue-eyed student back for this. The 4 members of Team 7 walked alongside the caravan at various points. Kakashi in the far back, Sakura and Sasuke along the middle, and Naruto in front. They were currently on their 3rd C-rank mission to safely escort one of Konoha's more successful merchants to the Land of Fire's capital city. Their client, Hayato Ichiro, had received some threatening letters from an anonymous source. As such, the Hokage had offered the service of one of his best genin teams, Team 7 led by legendary ninja, Sharingan no Kakashi. Kakashi had informed his students that unlike their first 2 C-rank missions, simple deliveries that went smoothly, this mission they were on had a high possibility of bandit action. He was not worried though, not from misplaced arrogance, but from complete confidence he had in the skills of the members of his team. The past 3 months since his team was formed has seen significant improvements in 2 of his students. He had refined Sasuke's taijutsu and added a few fire jutsu to his arsenal. For Sakura he had procured a few medical jutsu scrolls and some genjutsu scrolls as well, while working on improving her abysmal physical attributes like strength and stamina. As for his last student, well, he provided something of a sparring partner to help keep Naruto in tip-top shape. He had long since come to accept that his third student was significantly more skilled than any other in his generation, and that he would never know just how powerful. He had also taught his students the tree-walking exercise, although he got the distinct impression that Naruto was just humoring him. He had also made an effort to discover his students' chakra affinities and found that Sasuke had a major affinity for fire, and a minor one for lightning. Sakura had a single affinity for earth-based jutsu. And Naruto, surprisingly, had a major affinity for lightning, though he had demonstrated the ability to use any of the other 4 chakra types. A few decades after Naruto had begun jumping realities, he had realized that he needed to do something to keep his life from being dull and monotonous. So, he came up with a system where during a new life, he would stick to one branch of the ninja arts. Sometimes he would mainly focus on taijutsu, and maybe even only on one style. Other times, he became for kenjutsu what made a guy was for taijutsu, and yet other times he only utilized combination affinities like Hyoden, ice release, Mokuton, wood release, and so on. He still remembered a particular timeline in which Gaara was too far gone to save. He had gone full Biju in the stadium during the Chunin selection exams. Before chaos had fully descended, Naruto had calmly clapped his hands and in a voice that cut through the rising panic, he intoned. Mokuton Hajutsu. Jukai Koden, wood release secret technique, birth of the dense woodland. Jaws had dropped in stunned shock as numerous trees promptly erupted from the ground, bound, and then subdued Ichibi no Shukaku. Ah, good times. Regardless, this time around he had chosen to present lightning as his main chakra affinity. Naruto quickly refocused on the present as his acute sense picked up the presence of a huge number of civilians somewhere down the path. Utilizing the pre-agreed signal, he subtly notified Sasuke and Sakura of an impending ambush. He was confident that Kakashi was already aware of the hidden bandits. With practiced movements, the civilians in the merchant train moved closer to the carriages as Sasuke and Sakura spread out in preparation. Sakura fought to keep her hands from shaking as she realized that she would soon have to put into practice all that Kakashi had taught her these past 3 months. Sasuke clenched and unclenched his fists, the only sign of his nerves, before he silently berated himself for such weakness. He reminded himself that he was at a level where common bandits were merely nuisances. Furthermore, and here he threw a glance at his ever-unruffled teammate, this was a chance to show Naruto that he was more than his equal. He took a deep breath and released it just as the first of the bandits sprung out of hiding. Sasuke's arms were already in motion, blurring as he released shuriken after shuriken towards the group approaching from the left of the caravan. Sakura hesitated only a moment before she too joined Sasuke in taking out as many of the bandits as she could before they entered close range. By the time the attacking bandits had gotten close enough to engage in close combat, half of them had fallen to the deadly cloud of projectiles hurled at them. Sakura was not even aware that tears were flowing from her eyes as her relatively weak taijutsu was more than enough to take down bandit after bandit. Sasuke's eyes were grim and focused as he cut through the group of bandits around him. He didn't even flinch as his kunai penetrated through the skull of an attacking bandit. The night of his family's massacre had long since desensitized him to such bloodshed. Naruto and Kakashi had ignored the approaching bandits, continuing to read their respective books. The bandits, seeing their disinterest, became incensed and surged on more vigorously. The moment they entered into close range with Kakashi, it was all over. Kakashi's figure flickered in place, and one by one, like puppets with their strings cut, the attacking bandits began to fall with their throats slit. Naruto, on the other hand, did not react until the bandit in front of the charging horde was practically breathing on him. The lead bandit screamed out, "Die," and brought his raised sword down on Naruto. Sasuke and Sakura whirled around at the sound of the maddened shout in time to witness the descending blade bite into Naruto's shoulder, stopping at his chest. Before a ferocious grin could form on the bandit's face, Naruto's calm voice carried on the wind, originating from the top of the leading carriage, Kai. The Naruto who had just gotten cut exploded with a crackling surge of supercharged lightning. The bandit in contact with him was flash-fried to ash instantly, while powerful bolts of lightning leapt from surrounding bandit to surrounding bandit, short-circuiting their brains and stopping their hearts. After a several seconds-long light show, all was finally still. The disturbed dust cleared to reveal the charred and smoking corpses of about 10 bandits. The civilians, Sasuke and Sakura, all stared at the scene of destruction, until they were distracted by the sound of a page being turned. They all looked to the top of the first carriage to find Naruto still reading his damnable book, as though he had not just wiped out a group of bandits in one move. A few minutes after the ambush, after Sakura had finished throwing up, though her shakes still persisted, the caravan resumed its journey, with the ninjas in their original positions. Kakashi had interrogated one of the surviving bandits to find out if there were any more attackers lying in wait. He learned that one of Hayato's rivals had contracted an infamous bandit group to rob and kill him. The first ambush had been carried out by a third of the bandit army, the rest laid in wait further down. They even had 1 or 2 genin dropouts among them. Kakashi had deemed his team sufficient enough to proceed. Nearly an hour later, Naruto and Kakashi picked up on the presence of the remaining bandits. Noticing that the main force was concentrated in one place further down the road, Kakashi decided that they would take the fight to them. Signaling his students to gather around, Kakashi laid out a plan of attack. Sakura would provide long-range support using kunai and shuriken, while Naruto and Sasuke would engage the bandits in close combat. Kakashi had chosen to observe his students, and would only step in if needed. Getting a nod from his students, he motioned for them to move out. Sakura Naruto and, realizing that it was a storage scroll, opened it to find a ready supply of kunai. She blinked in surprise at the gesture and only then realized that she had used up her supply of projectiles in the previous. She quickly cut that thought off before she could be sick again. She took a deep breath and got into position up in a tree that afforded her full view of the gathered bandits. Sasuke circled around to approach the gathered bandits from the other side, while Naruto went straight ahead. A classic pincer maneuver. The 70 bandits had no idea of the events that were about to befall them. The first indication that something was wrong was when the bandit closest to Sakura's position slumped over with a kunai sticking out of his forehead. A fireball launched from Sasuke's position took out 3 bandits standing close to each other, further worsening the chaos that had descended on the gathered attackers. Into this chaos, Naruto appeared, fluid and silent like the wind. He moved through the group of gathered bandits, his ninjutsu flashing like quicksilver, ending lives with every sweeping movement. Even Sasuke had been momentarily stunned at the grace with which Naruto used his blade. Shaking himself out of it, he drew dual kunais and charged into the fray. He killed bandits left and right using the Uchiha interceptor style, as well as interspacing his taijutsu assaults with the grand fireball jutsu. Sakura rained kunai down on the bandits from above, taking care not to hit any of her teammates. A few minutes after they began, all the bandits lay dead at their feet. Sasuke was panting and covered in blood. He cast a gaze at Naruto to find him unwinded and untouched by any of the blood he had spilt. In that moment, looking at Naruto calmly surveying the massacre he had just wrought, Sasuke realized just what his teammate was capable of. He allowed himself to acknowledge that sometimes Naruto simply scared him. Sakura was sitting slumped on the branch she had been standing on. Thankfully, this time she wasn't throwing up, she was merely shaking. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Naruto turn to face her, his eyes narrowed. Before she could wonder at his actions, he disappeared from her vision, only to appear next to her with his sword blocking the katana that had been aimed at her neck. She barely had time to flinch in shock before Naruto kicked her attacker away, and vanished to take care of him. Sasuke had seen Naruto appear next to Sakura in time to save her life. Since he was alert, he was able to sense the ninja approaching from behind. He smoothly pivoted, deflected the strike aimed at his torso and responded with a punishing blow that connected with his opponent's head. The blow forced some distance between the two combatants and Sasuke took a moment to assess his attacker. The other ninja was obviously at most a genin and Sasuke was confident that he could take him. He surged forward and engaged his opponent in a taijutsu battle which he ruthlessly dominated. Finally, after a few minutes, Sasuke created an opening into which he buried a kunai and watched dispassionately as his assailant bled out. He turned around only to receive a boot to the face that launched him into a tree. With his head ringing and his lungs struggling to breathe, he forced his eyes open to meet the malicious gaze of another ninja, this one obviously above genin level. He forced himself to his feet, preparing to engage this new enemy, knowing that he was quite possibly too drained to emerge victorious. The attacking ninja wove hand seals and allowed a bloodthirsty grin to appear on his face as he pronounced, Doten. Doryuden, Earth Release. Earth Dragon Bullet. Sasuke watched grimly as a dragon head made of earth emerged from the ground and aimed at him. His muscles coiled, preparing to launch him to the side, when both combatants were interrupted by another voice intoning, Raiden. Raikyu, Lightning Release. Lightning Ball. A bright blue ball of tightly leashed lightning plowed through the head of the rising earth dragon and continued on to the enemy ninja, who only just jumped out of the way. Naruto landed in front of Sasuke, facing their mutual enemy. Sasuke, who was too tired to put up a fuss about being rescued, allowed his body to slide down the tree he was leaning against. A clone seemed to step out of Naruto's back, and it moved forward to tend to his wounds using a first aid kit Naruto handed it. Without taking his eyes off his opponent, Naruto spoke with his ever-calm tone. You are the last enemy left alive. Surrender and I will spare you. Both Sasuke and the ninja were taken aback at the finality in Naruto's statement. Shaking off any hesitation the Chunin-level ninja might have felt, he prepared to engage this obvious genin. Up in the branches, hidden from all but Naruto's senses, Kakashi watched as his blonde-haired student defended his teammate. He decided to take this opportunity to see if he could finally gauge his enigmatic student's level. The enemy Chunin rapidly covered the distance between Naruto and himself and launched a spinning kick at his head. Naruto's right arm came up and blocked the opening attack. Not giving his assailant any chance to recover, Naruto's left hand came up with his ninjutsu aimed to pierce the ninja's chest, only to go through a log as his opponent replaced himself. Naruto ducked as a katana cut through the place his neck had been moments before. He spun around and deflected a thrust aimed at his chest, and continued to parry all attacks coming his way with casual ease. He noticed that the more he toyed around with his opponent, the angrier and sloppier his motions became. Deciding that he needed one more push, he turned his body away from his enemy, and while his right hand kept on parrying all attacks aimed at him, his left hand reached into his pouch, pulled out his ever-faithful book, and he began to read. All the people present in the clearing gaped at him, the attacking ninja included. With a vein throbbing in his head, he stomped his foot and screamed out, Doden. Doryuso, Earth Release. Rising Stone Spears. The ground around Naruto surged upwards in the form of hardened spikes of stone. Before any of the rising spears could harm him, Naruto stretched his sword out and spun his body in a circle while saying, Raiden. Kangekia, Lightning Release. Wave of Inspiration. Lightning surged down his blade and erupted in a straight line from the tip, resulting in a 10-foot-long blade of condensed lightning chakra with which he described a circle, 10 feet in radius. The lightning cut through the spikes as though they were not even there. When he came out of his spin, he was facing the ninja, and before the ninja could launch another attack, Naruto indicated that he should look at his feet. Almost against his will, his gaze dropped down to find a kunai planted in front of him. Bewildered, he looked left and right to find kunai there as well, almost as though he were standing in a triangle. With a dawning sense of dread he looked up in time to hear Naruto speak. Raiden. Kaminari Shibari. Lightning Release. Thunder Binding. Lightning burst forth from each of the three kunai to form a pyramid of crackling energy. The ninja struck one of the walls of the barrier with his sword, only to drop it as a current was grounded via his body, resulting in a painful shock. Seeing that the enemy was safely contained, Naruto turned a bland look up at Kakashi's hiding place, causing his sensei's eyes to widen in shock. Brushing off his surprise, he sunshined to his student's position and patted him on his head with an eye smile. Sakura had gotten out of her tree already and was finishing the job Naruto's clone had started in bandaging up Sasuke's wound. Both she and Sasuke had been stunned to see the way their teammate handled the enemy ninja, both fully aware that neither of them could have faced an opponent of that caliber. Kakashi turned his attention to the Chunin, who paled when he recognized the legendary ninja that was eyeing him like one of his ninkin. Wowling for Naruto to release the lightning prison, he blurred forward and took hold of the Chunin, then vanished to question him. The screams of pain and terror, which originated from the direction Kakashi took the enemy ninja, served to remind his three students that for all his laziness and goofing off, their sensei was still the legendary shinobi, copy ninja Kakashi. Kakashi finished interrogating his prisoner and determined that there would be no more ambushes along the way. He returned to his students and instructed them on how to clean up after such battles. even showing them how to scavenge any useful items. After the 3 students of Team 7 had cleared up the dead bodies, with Sasuke getting to use his fire jutsu on the bodies, Kakashi led them back to the caravan. He was pleasantly surprised to note that Naruto had left a few clones to make sure that the caravan remained unharmed while they were taking care of the last of the bandits. In short order, the merchant train resumed its journey and with no further complications, finally arrived at their destination. Kakashi got the mission scroll signed and turned to lead his team back to Konoha. The cry of a messenger falcon drew his attention, and noticing the Konoha symbol on its band, he raised a hand for it to land on. He retrieved the message and read it quickly. When he realized that he did not need to respond, he allowed the falcon to leave and turned to face his team. His voice was grim as he spoke. Team 10 has requested immediate backup. Their Junin sensei is injured and we are the closest team to them. Sakura perked up at the opportunity to meet Ino again and asked him where they were going. The answer came to Naruto before Kakashi spoke it. The land of waves. Kakashi's sensitive nose finally picked up the scent of a large body of water up ahead. Finally, we're almost there. He had been leading his team at a punishing pace, cutting a direct path from the land of fire's capital to the land of water. They had had to stop for a break once, when Sakura missed the jump to the branch ahead of her due to fatigue. Only Naruto's quick reaction had saved her from serious injury. He had been glad to notice that while Sasuke had been slightly winded, he could still clearly continue for longer. Neither he nor Naruto had even felt the exertion of the pace yet. After that quick break, they had resumed their tree jumping towards wave and were now finally approaching it. Kakashi stealthily led his team on a circuitous route to the target's house, intending to conceal their presence from any hostiles in the area, for as long as he could. When they got close enough to the client's house, they dropped down to walk the rest of the way. Walking at the head of the formation, his lack of reading material expressing the level of his seriousness, Kakashi cut an intimidating figure. Without breaking stride, he casually called out, "Gen and Nara, report." Sakura and Sasuke were startled, though Sasuke hid his surprise better, and turned to notice Shikamaru emerge from a shadowed portion of the forest they were cutting through. Running a lazy gaze over the team, he replied in a voice tinged with relief. "We encountered the first sign of hostilities a few hours after leaving Konoha, 2 Chunin, the demon brothers. Asuma-sensei took them out, then got the full story from Tazuna-san. Ino wanted to continue and eventually managed to convince sensei to as well. Next we encountered a rank missing in Momochi Zabuza. Sensei engaged with him and got injured, though he was able to injure him in return." Given a simple nod to his report, Kakashi continued on towards the house in the clearing, Shikamaru following along with the rest of Team 7. Before he got to the door, it was flung open to reveal the visibly relieved face of Yamanaka Ino. Rushing forward, the blonde-haired Kunoichi spoke in an anxious tone. "Kakashi-sensei, thank Kami you're here. Asuma-sensei is hurt, can you help him?" Giving an eye smile, Kakashi replied, "I'm sure Sakura can be of some help with that. Why don't we go inside to see him, At the mention of Sakura, Ino finally noticed the students that trailed behind the legendary Junin. She cast a disbelieving glance at Sakura, completely doubting her usefulness in the situation, and then turned an adoring smile on Sasuke. Sakura's buried fangirl reared its head and she growled at Ino to back off. Before the girls could start going at it, Naruto cut in between them, successfully distracting them from their petty arguments and reminding them of the seriousness of the situation. Sasuke didn't bother with them and simply followed the male members of his team into the house. With a shake of his head, Shikamaru followed after the 2 girls who had scrambled to follow Sasuke inside. The members of Team 7 entered a guest room, after greeting Tazuna's daughter, Tsunami, to find Choji keeping watch over his sensei. Asuma's labored breathing was the only sound in the room, and even from the door, Kakashi could make out the bandages and dried blood on his torso. Motioning for Sakura to attend to his downed comrade, he stepped inside the room. Sakura nervously stepped forward and initiated the Shoshin no Jutsu, mystical palm technique, and began to assess Asuma's condition. The gathered members of Team 10 felt rising hope as they watched Sakura work on their sensei. Their hopes were somewhat dashed though when Sakura ended the jutsu and spoke, with an embarrassed blush on her face. "I'm sorry sensei, there's not much that I know how to do yet. I was able to diagnose him to find that he had damaged ribs and has lost some blood. I was also able to heal some of the internal damage, but I can't do anything for his fever. Kakashi nodded to show her that it was fine, and that any little thing helps. Before Ino could let her anxiety get the best of her and cause her to deride Sakura, Naruto stepped past them, the green glow of the Shoshin no Jutsu illuminating Asuma's pale features. He placed his right hand on his chest and the left on his forehead. In a clinical tone, Naruto began to list the damages. He has 3 cracked ribs and 2 broken ones. He has lost a lot of blood and has internal bruising on some of his major organs. The major external injury is the cut running down his chest, and he has a high fever. Before the stunned and disbelieving gaze of the gathered ninjas, Asuma's breathing became less labored and some of his color returned to his face. They watched in amazement as the visible bruises seemed to age from angry purple to the yellow of almost mended skin. Even the massive cut running along his torso was healed somewhat. With a final surge of green chakra, Naruto moved back as Asuma took a deep breath and opened his eyes. The members of Team 10 forgot their surprise in favor of crowding around their sensei, expressing their relief at his return to consciousness. Naruto calmly ignored Kakashi's probing gaze and Sasuke and Sakura's stunned and annoyed looks, all in favor of watching the reunion of Team 10. Asuma finally turned his eyes to the amused gaze of his fellow Junin, and spoke in a slightly questioning tone, knowing that Kakashi wasn't all that capable with medical jutsu. "Ah, so they sent you, huh? Thanks for patching me up." Kakashi lazily motioned towards Naruto, causing Asuma's eyes to widen in surprise, before he gave the blue-eyed ninja a look of gratitude. Naruto merely inclined his head in acceptance of his thanks. He then said, "I'll leave you guys to it and go and check up on the clones I left to watch the house." Before Shikamaru could fully berate himself for getting distracted from his watch, Naruto glided out of the room, and not too long after, they heard the sound of the front door closing. Giving Kakashi a look, expressing that he wanted to talk to him about whatever that was later, Asuma turned back to reassuring his students. Later in the evening, after Kakashi and Asuma had talked in more detail about the mission and their respective students, the 8 shinobis sat around the dining table, along with Tazuna, and TSMPTY's seat was left beside Tsunami for her son, Inari. During the meal, Inari kept scowling at the ninjas seated around the table, slowly causing Sakura and Sasuke to become uncomfortable. Having not had to put up with his behavior before, he seemed to find fault especially with Naruto, who throughout the meal had blatantly ignored him, not even giving any response to his dark glowers. After dinner, Naruto thanked Tsunami for the meal and promptly left the house, after mentioning that he would take the first watch. Asuma wanted to protest, thinking that Naruto had already done enough for the day, but he relented when Kakashi pointed out that the kid had more stamina than any 2 of the ninjas present, combined. Naruto had been sitting on the roof for 30 minutes before he heard the sound of someone climbing up to his spot, attempting to do so without being noticed. With no prior warning to indicate that he was aware of the person's presence, he spoke softly. "Is there something you needed, Sasuke?" Startled at being detected, Sasuke's brows furrowed before he decided to continue with the reason he had followed his teammate. Clenching his fists and speaking in a forceful and demanding tone, Sasuke replied, "I want to know where you learnt the things that you know." Taking Naruto's silence as confusion, he elaborated, "A few years ago you were just a dead last wannabe ninja who was never going to amount to anything. Then you vanish for 3 months, only to return like this. I want to know how." Without turning his head, Naruto spoke into the air. "And you, Sakura? Do you also want to know the answers to these questions?" Sasuke twitched, and then internally berated himself for letting his need for answers distract him from his surroundings. Sakura scrambled fully onto the roof and spoke up with a huff. "Yes, I do. Where did you learn the medical jutsu you used? How did you learn to use a sword like you did? Also, how come you can do all those things like tree walking and even seal-less, silent ninjutsu?" Sasuke's annoyance at Sakura's intrusion was forgotten as she pointed out other pertinent issues. Together, the both of them turned demanding gazes on their final teammate. Naruto's shoulders tensed, causing the other 2 to lean forward, thinking that they were getting to him. They flinched back in surprise the next moment as Naruto threw back his head and let loose belly-aching laughter. Sasuke and Sakura were too annoyed at being laughed at to appreciate how pleasantly smooth and deep Naruto's laugh was. After he had gotten over his amusement, Naruto stood and turned to face his teammates, fully aware that Asuma, Kakashi, and the genin of Team 10 were listening into their conversation. His face was devoid from any of his previous amusement, and with a serious tone that cut deeply into his demanding comrades, he said, "Get over yourselves. You seem to be suffering under the absurd belief that I owe you any explanations. When I was the dead last wannabe ninja, did you not ridicule and deride me? Now that I am skilled and capable, you believe yourself privy to my secrets? Ridiculous. We are teammates, and inherent in that description is the understanding that during missions I watch your back and expect you to watch mine. However, nowhere in that definition is the understanding that you have any right to know anything personal about me. We are teammates, but you spent years showing me that we are not friends." Over the course of his speech, Sakura had been growing more shamefaced, while Sasuke had grown tenser and tenser. Neither of them had anything to say to the stark truth that Naruto had just hurled into their faces, and so they turned to leave. Concealed in the shadows, Asuma and Kakashi shared grim looks, while in the house, Shikamaru, Choji, and Ino shared confused glances. The next morning, Tsunami's cry of surprise had most of the present ninja hurry downstairs to find out what was wrong. They stopped at the entrance to the dining room when they noticed the breakfast spread that was laid out on the table. While it was true that most of it was made of fish, it still smelled and looked appetizing. Tsunami's surprised look revealed that she was not the one responsible for the wonderful meal. Naruto, appearing from the kitchen, carrying what looked like tea, answered the question of who prepared the meal. Tsunami turned to him to protest, but he interrupted her with a shake of his head and an eye smile. Smiling fondly at the kind young man, she sat in the seat he pulled out for her. The others got over their surprise and took their seats at the table. Choji was the first to try some of the food. The others watched as his eyes widened in obvious surprise, before he began to pile on more food, which was the signal for everyone else to tuck in. Naruto graciously accepted the compliments that came from their hosts and the members of Team 10. He also mentioned to Tsunami that the rest of the fish he caught was placed in the freezer. Thanking him again for his help, she began to clear away the dishes, turning down the kids' offers to help her. Kakashi gathered the 6 young ninjas around him and began to explain the situation in Wave and how they would go about completing their mission. "I discussed with Asuma, and we came to the conclusion that the hunter ninja who interrupted your encounter with Zabuza is an accomplice of his. Taking into consideration the damage Asuma was able to inflict on him, I give him 4 more days before he is recovered enough to launch another attack. So, here is what we'll do. Choji, Ino and Shikamaru will guard Tazuna today, while Sakura will stick with Tsunami during the day. Sasuke and Naruto, I want you two to gather more information about the situation in Wave. We will meet again after dinner to share our findings. Any questions?" Seeing that none of them had any questions, he motioned them to move out. The students of Team 10 followed Tazuna to the bridge, while Sakura left to join Tsunami in the kitchen. Sasuke threw a glance at Naruto, then left to complete his mission. Naruto stood up to leave as well, but he was stopped by Kakashi's voice. Naruto glanced at him at that pause. Sighing, he turned fully to face his teacher and said, "Kakashi-sensei, if this is about what happened yesterday night, don't worry. No matter what my feelings about them are, they are still my teammates. I will not become worse than trash." Taken aback at Naruto's statement, Kakashi smiled with pride at his student and simply nodded. As Naruto prepared to leap into the trees surrounding the house, his acute hearing picked up Asuma's words. "He's a good kid, Kakashi." "Yes, he is." And then in a tone filled with amusement, Asuma inquired, "Kakashi-sensei?" Naruto didn't bother with trying to muffle his laughter at Kakashi's drawled reply. You say something, Asuma?" Sasuke gazed intently at the rowdy men who had just left the bar. He had identified them as possible employees of Gato and had been tailing them for the past few hours as they moved from bar to bar, occasionally stopping to harass a passing villager. He hoped that they would finally be returning to whatever stronghold Gato had set up. He stalked them stealthily as they moved towards a huge building, from which he could hear the sounds numerous men talking. He jumped to a tree closer to the building and looked into one of the higher windows there. He spied a gathering of about 60 men, bandits, judging by their weapons and dressing. He looked around, casting out his senses as well, but he couldn't detect any shinobis among them. Taking another moment to memorize all that he could about the gathered army, he left to return to Tazuna's house for dinner. As he was jumping to another rooftop on the way, he noticed a flicker of gold in the corner of his vision. Stopping on the next rooftop, he turned to see that it was his teammate's gold hair that drew his attention. Looking closer, he noticed that Naruto was surrounded by a group of kids, ranging from about 4 to 10 years old. He seemed to be playered. He took some time to confirm that his initial suspicion was indeed correct. Now he was incredulous, assuming that his teammate had wasted time with the children instead of completing his mission. He turned back to look at the scene, only to lock gazes with the searing blue eyes of his fellow team member. He was startled for an instant, before he scowled and turned away. Still, he noticed how the kids were obviously reluctant to let Naruto leave, before he created a clone to the amazement of the children. Leaving the clone to stay with the kids, Naruto jumped to the building Sasuke was on, and with a glance at him, took off towards Tazuna's house. Tsunami had used the fish Naruto caught, as well as the few things she was able to buy from some merchants, to prepare the evening meal. During the meal, she and Tazuna spoke about their day, making sure to express gratitude towards the ninjas that were protecting them. Ino and Sakura then began to talk to Tsunami about girl stuff, while Tazuna engaged Asuma in a discussion. During the course of the meal, Naruto had been aware of Inari's steadily worsening mood. So when the little boy slapped his hand on the table, Naruto was not among those who flinched at the sudden noise. "Why do you bother? What makes you think that you can stand up to Gato? What's the point in trying when you're all going to die anyway?" Inari ran his gaze along those seated at the table, pleased to notice that he had grabbed their attention, until he noticed the repeated sound of chopsticks clinking against ceramic. Turning to Naruto, who was still eating, he snarled out. "And you piss me off the most. Didn't you hear what I just said? You're all going to die, so why do you bother trying? There are no such things as heroes, so just give up before you die." Silence reigned in the room until Naruto finished his meal. Murmuring his thanks to Tsunami, he turned his gaze on Inari. After giving him a thoughtful look, he said, "You must really hate your grandfather, and your mother too." Visibly taken aback at that statement, Inari gained a look of confusion on his face, but before he could respond, Naruto continued. "You say that we are all going to die and so we shouldn't bother trying. Yet, we are assigned to protect your family. Your grandfather and your lovely mother. That means that, by your argument, we should stop protecting them and let Gato do what he wants with them. Therefore, you must hate them." Inari's mouth opened and closed at Naruto's words, unable to think of anything to say, while the others watched on. Standing up, Naruto began to clear away his used plates, and while doing so, he continued to speak. "You say that heroes do not exist. I say otherwise, but you are entitled to your opinions. I will say this though. All it takes for a hero to be made is for someone to stand up when others would sit down. It's for one person to raise their head when others would keep their heads down. It's for someone to speak out when others would remain silent. It's for someone to say enough, when others would just roll over and take it. At the end of the day, evil can only exist when good people do nothing." Quote. On that final note, Naruto left to place his dishes in the sink, leaving the room in silence with Inari slumped and considering the words Naruto just spoke. The 8 ninjas from Konoha were gathered around the table in the dining room, all leaning over a map of Wave Village, as they each gave their assessments of the situation. The students of Team 10 reported that nothing was amiss during the time they spent with Tazuna at the bridge, except for some of the man's workers deciding to quit out of fear of Gato. Sakura spoke about the poor living conditions she witnessed when she followed Tsunami. When it got to Sasuke's turn, he leaned forward and reported about the men he tailed, while marking out their location on the map. He mentioned what he noticed about the state of their weapons and any signs of sword training. He made sure to detail their numbers and anything else he might have heard them talk about. When he was done, he threw a slightly condescending smirk at Naruto, assuming that his teammate had wasted the entire day playing with the children and as such, had nothing to report. Naruto began to speak in an even tone, all the while placing markers on the map to denote the locations of the places he was speaking about. Gato has a total of 250 mercenaries in his employ. Most of them spend a majority of their time in these 3 bars, located here, here, and here. He has 4 buildings set up for their housing at these locations. There are 4 lead bandits, each in charge of 60 men, who seem to have had some samurai training. These 4 bandits also have reasonably good equipment, armor and swords. The bandits patrol the village from time to time, usually harassing the villagers. As for Gato himself, he is located in the huge building at the center of that little island. He always has 6 bandits with him, and from what I saw, those 6 are the best trained of all the bandits he has. I was also able to locate the hideout of Momochi Zabuza and his ninja accomplice, called Haku. As Naruto had begun speaking, eyebrows had been steadily rising at the detailed and comprehensive report. Sasuke, in particular, was completely flummoxed at how much Naruto had been able to learn during the course of the day. However, when Naruto mentioned the missing nin, eyes widened all around. He continued before anyone could interrupt him. I was able to spy on them enough to know that this Haku has some knowledge of healing herbs, and as such, Zabuza should be ready to attack in 2 days at the earliest, tomorrow, if he pushes himself. One final thing, I also learned some information that suggests that Gato plans to gate crash the confrontation between us and pick off the survivor. Done. Naruto leaned back and gave the others time to digest his long report. Being a prodigy, Kakashi was the first to process all the information and reach the proper conclusion. Gato never planned to pay Zabuza in the end. Also, after the fight, the survivor might be tired enough to get taken out by such a large force of bandits. He then cast a serious gaze at the genin gathered around him before meeting Asuma's eyes. Reading the reluctant acceptance in them, he continued. Seeing as how Asuma is not yet healed enough for a confrontation so soon, I will be facing Zabuza alone. This means it will fall to all of you to handle the accomplice as well as the mercenaries who might come after. The grim reality of the situation fully dawned on the gathered genin, and most of them found it hard to fathom. The genin of Team 7, having already had their first kills, were not as nervous as the others though. Nodding once he saw that they understood the situation, he dismissed them from the meeting, telling them to get as much rest as they could since they would all be following Tazuna to the bridge the next day. He turned back to Asuma to finish planning for the impending confrontation. During breakfast the next day, everyone was on edge. Sensing the tension in the air, the civilians were quiet all throughout the meal. None of them commented when Kakashi casually suggested that Tsunami and Inari should probably stay in all day with Asuma. After the meal, the genins of Team 7 and Team 10 followed Kakashi out, leaving Asuma to guard Tsunami and Inari. Kakashi instructed the genin of Team 10 to follow Tazuna towards the bridge, while Kakashi would lead his team through the trees, attempting to maintain the element of surprise. When they arrived at the bridge, they all noticed the heavy mist that hung in the air, obscuring everything. Having already gotten Asuma's account on Zabuza's modus operandi, Kakashi knew that today was the awaited confrontation day. He was pleased to notice that Shikamaru had correctly interpreted the situation, and that he had gotten the attention of his teammates. When they got closer to the bridge, they were all able to see the unconscious and, in some cases, dead bodies of most of the BR cry of horror. Tazuna rushed towards the nearest person, asking what had happened. With his last breath, the worker replied. A demon. A malicious chuckle cut through the heavy fog, instantly putting the gathered ninja on edge. The silhouette of 2 people, one tall man and a shorter person, became visible in the mist. Slowly emerging from the dense fog, Zabuza was revealed, with a relatively short masked effeminate ninja beside him. Giving off another hair-raising chuckle, he inquired. What's this, baby genin without their mother hen of a Junin sensei? Well, this should be over quickly then. In a blur, he was standing next to Choji, his massive Zanbatsu already on a course to cleave the genin in twain. The sound of metal hitting metal cut through the air as a silver-haired figure was suddenly there, blocking the fatal attack. Zabuza's eyes widened in shock, before he choked on his breath, as a blade erupted from his chest. Barely managing to turn his head around, his eyes landed on a mop of golden hair. Even with his sword pierced through the demon of the mist's chest, Naruto's eyes were focused elsewhere. The impaled figure standing near him suddenly turned into water, as the clone was dispelled by the fatal hit. The sound of slow, mocking applause came from somewhere else, as another Zabuza stepped into view, his eyes locked on the genin that had taken out his clone. By this time, the other genin were only just catching up with Naruto's actions. The members of Team 10 were extremely shocked at the speed and proficiency their peer displayed. However, Zabuza's voice pulled them out of their contemplation. Hitaki Kakashi, the copy ninja. I'm looking forward to this fight. Haku, take care of the blonde-haired one. In a flash, Kakashi engaged Zabuza, taking their fight away from the rest. Haku stepped forward to fight Naruto, but he was interrupted by Sasuke. I'll be your opponent. And before any of the others could respond to that change, he dashed forward to clash with Haku. Naruto merely turned to the rest and told them to get into formation around Tazuna. He turned back to face the mist, keeping an eye on the respective fights going on at that time. Kakashi used the kunai in his right to deflect the swing of the Zanbatsu, and then he followed up with a blurring jab towards Zabuza's torso with his left. The kunai held in his hand plunged into his opponent's chest, but he never faltered as he ducked in time to avoid a beheading strike from behind. Placing his hand on the floor, he sprung back with a full kick, which was only just blocked by Zabuza's quick reflexes. He still got pushed back though, allowing the two ninja to pause for a moment. Finally deciding to stop feeling each other out, the two blurred towards each other, significantly faster than before. Sasuke used the pause between their exchanges to take another measure of his opponent. He wasn't too certain if it was a boy or girl he was fighting, but it didn't matter. His opponent was fast, maybe even faster than him, although his hits were stronger. They had been going at it for a few minutes and neither was gaining the upper hand. He focused on his opponent, Haku, in time to hear a voice. "Please surrender. I do not wish to harm you." Scoffing at that statement, Sasuke dashed back in with a roundhouse kick aimed at Haku's head. Having learned by now, Haku elected to dodge instead of block. Leaning back out of the way, he returned with a series of lightning-fast jabs which Sasuke only just managed to block. Suddenly pulling a senbon out of the air, Haku lurched forward to disable Sasuke, only to have a kunai interrupt the path of his needle. Knowing that he stood no chance of overpowering the other ninja, Haku finally decided to use jutsu. Speaking to Sasuke, he said, "You should have given up when you had the chance, now, you have already lost." Sasuke's eyes widened as he noticed his opponent weaving one-handle seals. Suddenly Haku stomped his foot and said, "Hyeten. Sensatsu Suisho, Ice Release. Death by 1,000 flying water needles." His gaze was drawn downwards as he noticed the movement of the puddle of water next to them. Suddenly, the water sprang up into the air and froze into lethal ice needles before his disbelieving eyes. Knowing what would come next, Sasuke's eyes frantically searched for an escape route. Wanting to smack himself for being dumb, he channeled chakra to his legs and blurred out of the way in time to escape being made into a pincushion. Haku glanced left and right, looking for his elusive prey, before a shadow had him looking up, only to receive a powerful kick to the face. Sasuke smirked as he watched Haku painfully get back to his feet. His smirk left his face at Haku's next words. "I did not want to go this far, but for Zabuza-sama I will kill my heart, and kill you." Hyeten. Makyu Hyosho, Ice Release, Demonic Ice Crystal Mirrors. Sasuke watched with rising trepidation as a dome, made up of numerous ice mirrors, rose up around him. Haku stepped into the mirror nearest to him, and suddenly, his image appeared in every single mirror. Every single one of the images held up a couple of senbon and took aim. Suddenly the air was filled with flashing needles and before Sasuke knew what had happened, he found himself stabbed in numerous places, needles sticking out everywhere. His eyes widened as his body lurched forward in shocked pain. Haku brought up another hand with senbon while Sasuke was pulling out whatever senbon he could get to. He vanished from the mirrors, blitzing through the air at insane speeds, leaving Sasuke with many more senbon sticking out of his body. Against his will, a scream of intense pain was wrenched from his throat as he fell to his knees, his body incapable of putting up with the strain. Kakashi whipped around at the pained sound coming from where the genin were. Before he could go and check up on them, Zabuza was suddenly in his face, swinging at him. Having already revealed his Sharingan eye, he was able to dodge the swipes and retaliate when he saw an opening. The figure in front of him turned to water at his fatal strike, causing him to whirl in surprise, searching for his foe. A quicksilver flash of intuition had him speeding towards Tazuna, arriving just in time to get the old man out of the way of Zabuza's strike. His maneuver was not without cost however, and he gained a long gash along his chest for his troubles. Not even flinching at the pain, he lashed out with a powerful kick which connected and propelled Zabuza away from the genin. Pausing in his dash to re-engage the Nukenin, he locked gazes with Naruto and after a moment, he nodded at his student. Naruto threw a glance at the four genin behind him as his sensei dashed off once more. He spoke up in his usual calm and unbothered tone. "Stay and keep an eye on the old man. Sakura, prepare to give aid to Sasuke. I'll be returning with him shortly." He then turned back to the mist, and vanished without a trace. Haku prepared to throw a final barrage of senbon at his opponent. They had been at it for minutes now, and Sasuke had noticed that over time, his eyes were getting more attuned to Haku's dazzling speeds. Finally noticing that he could almost follow his enemy's movements, he realized that he must have awakened his bloodline limit, the Sharingan. A quick glance into one of the mirrors revealed that his deductions were spot on. It was pointless however as, after attempting to use a grand fireball to melt a mirror, and failing, he was too low on chakra to do anything with his Sharingan except watch his death approach. He looked on as Haku prepared what would be the last of the senbon barrages. Knowing that he couldn't do anything to prevent it, he waited to die. As Haku vanished from his mirror, zipping across the air at tremendous speeds, uncountable senbon cut through the air, all aimed at vital spots on Sasuke's body. They never hit. There was suddenly a blur of red, silver and gold continually surrounding Sasuke, followed by a sound like tinkling bells as every single senbon was deflected by fast that there was practically a circle of unyielding metal around him. Both Sasuke and Haku gaped in disbelieving shock as Naruto slowed down from his high-speed movement around Sasuke, having just knocked all the airborne senbon out of the air with his ninjutsu. Sasuke was in a state of shock. His Sharingan had been active when his teammate came to his aid, and still, all he was able to perceive was an indistinguishable blur. Impossible, his mind shouted, no one can be that fast. Haku shook off his shock and observed the newcomer. Before he could say anything to him, Naruto spoke. I heard you when you said that you wanted to avoid the bloodshed, so, I will give you the chance to surrender now, before I am forced to take you down. Looking at the new arrival, Haku was filled with the certainty that he was no match for the blonde-haired ninja before him. Brushing off whatever reservations he had, he prepared to pepper the two ninjas with more senbon. Seeing Haku preparing his assault, Naruto sighed out sadly. Before Haku could begin to move, Naruto spun and faced the exact mirror which contained the real body of Haku. Haku's eyes had not finished widening in surprise before Naruto intoned, Raiden. Gion, lightning release. False darkness. A bright white spear of crackling lighting flashed out of Naruto's mouth, covering the distance to the ice mirror in an instant. Haku was unable to dodge it in time and so braced himself for impact as the spear reached the mirror, not expecting what happened next. The spear of lightning tore through the mirror like Haku's senbons cut through the air moments before, causing Haku to let loose a gasp of pain as the bolt propelled him away, shocking him terribly. Sasuke's wide eyes traveled from the newly made hole in the dome to his teammate. He suddenly felt a powerful surge of glee as he realized that he had had his Sharingan trained on Naruto when his teammate was performing the technique. His feeling of triumph was ruthlessly squashed in the next instant when he remembered that his teammate never used hand seals. The gleam of amusement in Naruto's blue eyes told Sasuke that he knew what he was thinking. Gritting his teeth, he turned away from his teammate in annoyance, only to be startled as he felt a hand on his shoulder, before the world blurred around him. He noticed that he was suddenly standing a few yards away from the other genin, just in time for his legs to finally fail him. Sakura and Ino caught him before he fell and began to fuss over his injuries, while arguing with each other on who should get to treat him. Seeing that they had everything in hand, Naruto turned to return to the lying figure of Haku. Approaching the slightly smoking body on the bridge, Naruto noticed that Haku was lying face down. As soon as he was a few steps away, Haku's body shifted, thrusting a senbon towards his eye. A few scant inches from impact, Naruto moved. Haku's thrust pierced through the head of the afterimage left behind by Naruto, even as his body was already curling from the impact of the elbow planted in his gut. He was suspended in that position for the length of a breath, before momentum kicked in and he was propelled viciously further into the mist. Walking forward, Naruto sensed that Gato had finally arrived. Deciding to wrap things up, he clapped his hands then threw them forward, while intoning, Fuden. Repusho, wind release. Gale palm. A surge of chakra-laced wind tore through the mist, easily dispelling it and revealing the entirety of the bridge for all to see. Zabuza was standing on the bridge, bleeding from various wounds on his body, and his eyes widened as soon as he noticed the defeated body of his accomplice lying close to him. Kakashi was perched on top of one of the high-rise beams directly above Zabuza, also with injuries of his own. Both their heads whipped to Naruto as he continued to walk forward. Casually raising an arm, Naruto pointed to the other end of the bridge. Slowly, They both turned to see Gato standing at the head of a huge bandit army. By this time, Haku had painstakingly gotten to his feet and limped to Zabuza's side. Zabuza's quick mind correctly deduced the reason for Gato's presence. Gritting his teeth, he spat out. "Gato, just what in the hell do you think you are doing?" Giving an oily smile to his employee, Gato responded. "Why, taking out an insurance policy, of course. Missing Nin are quite expensive, my friend, I'm sure you understand." Realizing that neither he nor Haku was in a good enough shape to take on all the bandits without risk, he turned to Kakashi. "It seems like our business here is done, Hitaki." Giving a nod to him, Kakashi jumped down to his blonde-haired student's position, sparing a moment to glance at the other genin gathered around Tazuna. Reassuring himself that they were fine, he turned back to face the situation at hand, cursing himself for getting carried away and using up as much energy as he had. He snapped out of his internal musings as he noticed Naruto stepping forward towards Zabuza and the fake hunter Nin. Zabuza and Haku tensed slightly as Naruto approached them. They didn't drop their guards even as he stepped past them, closer to Gato and the bandits. Turning his suddenly frigid gaze on the people in front of him, he spoke in a tone that effortlessly cut through the air, causing shivers of discomfort due to how lethal he sounded. "Just to be able to say I tried, I will give each of you the chance to leave here unharmed, as long as you never disturb this village again." Even Zabuza and Haku gaped at the genin for a moment, before the raucous laughter of the bandits drew their attention again. Naruto simply took another step forward, and partially slid his sword out of its sheath, preparing to draw it. Snorting at the child in front of him, the lead bandit stepped forward and shouted out. "Come on, boys, let's kill these pieces of trash and the old man. Then we can have our way with the rest of the villagers." The resulting roar of approval from the other bandits was so loud, it almost shook the bridge, also masking the sound of Naruto's blade returning to its sheath. The other genin paled slightly at the prospect of having to kill the bandits before them. The sound from the bandits was abruptly cut off as the air stilled and a crackling sound cut through the air. Everyone focused on Naruto to find his right arm held above his head, with his hand curled as though he were holding a javelin. In the cusp of his hand, yellow lightning crackled merrily away. With a steadily increasing hum in the air, Naruto's emotionless voice cut through the air like a herald for death. "Raiden. Raryu no Hautengeki, lightning release. Lightning Dragon's heavenward halberd." A glowing yellow halberd of supercharged death flashed into existence in Naruto's curled hand, which he then promptly threw forward. The attack sped through the air, reaching the front line of the gathered bandits before anyone could react. By that time, the bladed part of the halberd had widened to equal the width of the bridge, ensuring that it got everyone in its path. It sliced through the bandit horde, flash-frying internal organs, evaporating the blood in their veins, and destroying their brains. Moments before it got to Gato, who had long since retreated to the back of the group, it abruptly narrowed to the width of a man's torso. It pierced through Gato's chest and carried the screaming man out over the water, where it promptly detonated. Once the resulting light show ended, only the ash drifting down to the sea was left as proof that Gato ever existed. Naruto turned around to find Zabuza and Haku gaping at him with widened eyes. Looking past them, he met the proud eye of his teacher, and then the shocked and slightly frightened faces of his fellow genin. As he was walking back to the others on the bridge, a clone of his landed beside him, threw him a scroll, and then dispelled itself in a brief flash of lightning. He ignored the curious gazes of his teammates and turned to face Zabuza and Haku, who tensed under his cool gaze. He partway and swiped his finger along it. With a small puff of smoke, a bag was suddenly in his hand. He tossed it at Zabuza, who reflexively caught it. Looking inside, his eyes widened again as he noticed the large amount of money in it. Casting a questioning gaze at Naruto, he received a simple nod in response. Surprising Kakashi and the others watching them, he inclined his head towards Naruto, then turned with Haku and vanished from sight. Naruto returned to Kakashi's side in time to catch him as his chakra exhaustion finally caught up to him. He noticed that his sensei couldn't even summon up the energy to cover his transplanted eye, so he did it for him, to the visible relief of his teacher. Together, they made their way back to the rest of their team and the old man. The end. Remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.